Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I'm still trying to process what happened last week. I've been debating whether to even write this down, but I need to tell someone. And I know you guys won't think I'm crazy. At least I hope not. It was Thursday afternoon, and I was driving east on US 90. Nothing special about the day, partly cloudy, around 70 degrees, typical spring weather for our area. I was heading back from a job site, my truck bed full of tools, and I was looking forward to grabbing some lunch before my next appointment. The clock on my dashboard read 12:32 when everything happened. The stretch of road I was on is pretty familiar to me. I've driven it hundreds of times. It's mostly rural, fields, scattered houses, and wooded areas that run alongside the highway. I had just passed Boat Ramp Road, doing about 65 miles per hour, when something caught my eye up ahead. On this particular stretch, there's a small hill that rises from a two-track dirt road that branches off the highway. It's not very tall, maybe 30 feet high, but it's visible from a good distance. I noticed what I initially thought was an animal bent over on that hill. My first thought was maybe a deer or a large dog, though something seemed off about its shape. As I got closer, maybe 200 yards away, this thing suddenly bolted. Bolted. 1 second it was hunched over, seemingly examining something on the ground, and the next it was racing down the hill, directly toward the highway. The way it moved, I can't get it out of my head. It wasn't running like any animal I've ever seen. It was on all fours, but the movement was all wrong. Both of its arms would swing forward at the same time, then both legs would push off together in this bizarre, coordinated motion, almost like a frog's hop, but stretched out and fluid. It covered ground incredibly fast with each stride. My heart started racing as I realized it was heading straight for the road, straight for me. I hit the brakes instinctively, slowing from 65 to maybe 40 in a few seconds. My coffee spilled in the cup holder, splashing onto my jeans, but I barely noticed. I was completely focused on this thing. It reached the road just as I was approaching. It crossed right in front of my truck, maybe 30 feet ahead, in 3 or 4 of those strange bounds. I got a clear look at it as it passed. The sun was high overhead, so there weren't any weird shadow effects playing tricks on my eyes. This was real. This thing was big. If it had stood upright, it would have been at least 8 feet tall. It was thin but not scrawny, more like lean and athletic. The arms and legs were disproportionately long compared to its torso, giving it this stretched-out appearance. But what really struck me was the hair. The entire body was covered in deep red hair, about 4 inches long. It was matted and tangled, not smooth like a groomed animal's coat. As it moved, the hair bounced and swayed with each stride. I remember thinking it looked almost like rust-colored seaweed swinging from its frame. Its head stayed angled down the entire time, never looking up at me or my truck, but I could see it came to a sort of cone at the top. Not a rounded head shape like a person or a bear, but almost pointed. I couldn't make out any facial features, thank God. I don't think I want to know what its face looked like. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds, but it felt like slow motion. I watched as it bounded across the pavement and up the opposite embankment, disappearing into a thicket of trees. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles had turned white. I pulled over immediately, my truck halfway on the shoulder. My breathing was fast and shallow, and I could feel sweat beading on my forehead despite the AC blasting. I sat there for probably 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. There were no other cars on the road at that moment, not unusual for a weekday afternoon in this rural area. Part of me was relieved no one else was around, but another part wished there had been a witness. Someone to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. After I calmed down enough to drive, I continued east, watching the tree line carefully. The whole time, my mind was racing. Was it a bear with mange? No, the proportions were all wrong, and that movement, no bear moves like that. Some kind of escaped exotic animal, but from where? There's no zoo or wildlife sanctuary for miles. I thought about turning around and going back to look for tracks or signs, but something in my gut told me not to. An instinct, I guess. The same feeling you get when you're alone in the dark and sense something watching you. When I got home that evening, I tried to sketch what I'd seen, but I couldn't get it right. The proportions looked wrong on paper. The movement impossible to capture in a still image. I tore up my attempts and threw them away. I didn't tell my wife. What would I say? Hey honey, I think I saw Bigfoot today, except it was red and ran like a frog. She already thinks I work too much and don't get enough sleep. This would just confirm her suspicions that I'm overworked and seeing things. The next day, I drove the same route, deliberately passing by around the same time. I slowed down near that hill, scanning the area, but saw nothing unusual. Just trees swaying in the breeze and a couple of actual deer grazing far off in a field. I've been back 3 times since then. I don't know what I expect to find, but I can't stop thinking about it. Each time I park my truck on the shoulder and walk a little way into the trees on both sides of the highway. I've found nothing, no unusual tracks, no tufts of red hair caught on branches. Nothing to suggest that what I saw was real. But I know what I saw. The thing is, this isn't even the first time something strange has been spotted in this area. About 2 years ago, my buddy Mike, who works for the county road maintenance department, told me about something weird he saw early one morning while fixing potholes on that same stretch of US 90. He described seeing a tall, reddish-brown figure standing at the tree line watching him. When he looked back after grabbing his phone to take a picture, it was gone. I didn't think much of it at the time, figured he was exaggerating or had seen a deer standing on its hind legs to reach leaves. Mike's known to embellish stories, especially after a few beers, but now I believe him. There's also old Mrs. Sanderson, who lives about half a mile from that spot. She's in her 80s and has lived in the same farmhouse for over 50 years. Last summer at the community barbecue, she mentioned something about the red ones that come through her property sometimes at night. Everyone just nodded politely, assuming it was an old woman's confusion or imagination. Now, I'm not so sure. The weird thing is, none of us really talk about these experiences beyond brief mentions. It's like there's an unspoken agreement not to dig too deep or draw attention to it. Maybe it's fear of ridicule, or maybe it's something deeper, some instinct telling us to leave it alone. I can't stop replaying the encounter in my mind, the way it moved across the road, that strange, coordinated bound that seemed both awkward and incredibly efficient. The hair swinging with each movement, the cone-shaped head always pointing downward. It was both animal-like and not like something that had adapted to move through our world, but didn't quite belong in it. Since that day, I've been having trouble sleeping. I keep waking up thinking I hear something moving outside our bedroom window. That same rhythmic sound of all fours hitting the ground in that peculiar pattern. Thump, 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 thump. But when I look out, there's nothing there. I've caught myself scanning the tree line whenever I drive now, especially at dusk or dawn. My wife asked why I've been taking the longer route to work lately. I told her there's road construction on US 90. There isn't. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know if it was some unknown species, some genetic anomaly, or something else. What I do know is that it was real, and it's changed how I see the world around me. The woods that I've always found peaceful now seem to hide secrets. The shadows between trees might not be empty. I'm not saying it was dangerous. It didn't act aggressively or even acknowledge me. But something that size, moving that fast with that much power, it could be dangerous if it wanted to be. I've thought about reporting it to someone, but who? The local sheriff would think I was drunk or sleep-deprived. Wildlife authorities would ask for evidence I don't have. And frankly, part of me doesn't want to draw attention to it or the area. What if people came looking for it with guns? What if they found it? So for now, I'm just writing this down, trying to make sense of what happened. If anyone else has seen something similar in the US 90 area, or anywhere else for that matter, I'd like to know I'm not alone in this. And if you're driving through that stretch of highway, especially around noon, when the sun is high and shadows are few, keep your eyes open. You might see something that doesn't fit into your understanding of the world. And if you do see it, that red-haired thing with the strange gait and the cone-shaped head, maybe just let it cross the road and go about its business. Some mysteries might be better left undisturbed. Story 2. I've been debating whether to share this for the longest time. It happened back in August 2014, but I still get chills thinking about it. The four of us, me, Rick, Jamie, and Dave, had been camping together for years. We weren't some clueless city folks who didn't know what we were doing. We were experienced backpackers who'd covered most of the major trails in the Pacific Northwest and Montana. This particular trip was supposed to be a 5-day hike through a remote section of Glacier National Park. We'd planned it for months, mapping our route carefully and packing all the right gear. We always took safety seriously, especially in bear country. On our second night, we set up camp in this beautiful little clearing near a small creek. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with a bright moon lighting up everything. Before turning in, we did what we always do. Secured our food in bear-proof containers about 70 yards from our tents, hanging what we could from trees and making sure everything smelled even remotely edible was properly stored. We sat around the small fire for a while, talking about the incredible views we'd seen that day, before turning in around 10. I remember checking my watch before zipping up my sleeping bag. The containers were sturdy as hell, reinforced plastic with metal locks that even park rangers said could withstand a determined grizzly. I fell asleep pretty quickly after a full day of hiking, but something woke me up. It was the footsteps that got me first. Heavy, deliberate, spaced wide apart, not like a deer or even a bear. I checked my watch again. It was almost exactly 1 in the morning. "You guys hear that?" I whispered. Wondering if I was the only one awake, Jamie and Dave were already sitting up in their sleeping bags. Rick was nearest to the tent flap, and he carefully unzipped it just enough to peek out. "There's something out there," he whispered. "By the food." I crawled over, trying not to make any noise. The moon was bright enough that we could see the clearing pretty well. What I saw standing near our food containers wasn't a bear. I'd seen bears before. This was different. It was tall, really tall, standing completely upright on 2 legs with broad shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist. In the moonlight, I could make out dark hair or fur covering its body. It moved with this weird smoothness that didn't seem normal. "What the fuck is that?" Dave breathed so quietly I barely heard him. None of us answered. We were just frozen, watching. The creature bent down at our food storage site and started manipulating the containers, not smashing them or clawing at them like a bear would. Its movements were deliberate, almost like it was examining the locking mechanisms. I could see what looked like arms reaching out, fingers working at the closures. We heard a loud snap, like a buckle or strap being torn free, then dragging noises. The breathing was what got to me the most, deep, heavy breaths that carried across the clearing. Not snarls or grunts like you'd expect from a bear, but controlled breathing, like a person exerting themselves. Rick's hand was shaking as he held the tent flap. "Should we yell? Make noise?" he whispered. I couldn't speak, literally could not form words. There was something about what we were seeing that just shut down the part of my brain responsible for taking action. It wasn't just fear, though I was terrified. It was like some primal part of me knew that whatever was out there was so far outside my experience that I had no response for it. Jamie grabbed my arm so hard it left marks I could still see the next day. "Don't move," he said. "Just don't." We watched as the creature worked at the containers for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes. Then it grabbed what appeared to be one of our food bags and moved away, dragging something else with it. The footsteps faded into the trees. None of us slept after that. We just sat in the tent, barely breathing, listening for any sign it was coming back. We didn't even talk. Just exchanged looks in the dim light, each of us trying to process what we'd seen. When the first light of dawn finally came, none of us wanted to be the first to go outside. Eventually, Jamie said, "We need to see what happened." The four of us stayed together, moving as a group toward where our food had been stored. The containers weren't there. We followed a drag mark in the dirt and found them about 100 yards away in a thicket of brush. "Jesus Christ," Rick muttered when we saw the damage. These weren't cheap containers. They were high-end, bear-proof cases that cost a couple $100 each. One of them had the lid completely cracked off, not chewed through or smashed. The thick plastic was actually torn, and the metal locking mechanism was bent outward like it had been pried with incredible force. The other container had been forced open as well, though not as dramatically. Food packages were scattered all around the area. Several were missing entirely. What struck me as odd was the pattern of the damage. Bears usually bite, claw, or crush things. They're messy but predictable. This was different. The packages were opened, some almost carefully, others torn precisely along seams. Dave, who'd been a wildlife biology major in college, was the first to spot the footprints. "Guys, look at this." The ground was soft enough from a recent rain that whatever had visited us had left clear impressions. They were feet, human-like feet, but enormous. Dave took out his camping multi-tool and measured them. Over 16 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide. You could see clear toe impressions, 5 of them, just like a human foot but larger. The stride length, the distance between footprints, was over 4 feet apart. "No person walks like this," Dave said, his voice shaking slightly. "And no bear made these." Jamie pointed to some broken branches about 7 feet off the ground. "Look at that." And there, food wrappers and residue were smeared against a tree trunk, nearly 7 feet up. Something had been standing there eating our food, tall enough to leave marks that high without reaching up. I felt sick, not just scared, but physically ill, like my body was rejecting what my mind was seeing. The four of us had been camping together for over a decade. We'd seen bears, mountain lions, all sorts of wildlife. This was something else entirely. Rick was the one who said what we were all thinking: "We need to get out of here now." No one argued. We packed up camp in record time, barely speaking as we stuffed sleeping bags and collapsed tents. We left some of the damaged food containers behind, taking only what we needed and could carry easily. Before we left, I took photos of everything. The damaged containers, the footprints with my boot next to them for scale, the marks on the trees. Part of me needed evidence, needed to confirm later that what we'd seen was real. The hike out was tense. We moved quickly, constantly scanning the forest around us. Every snapping twig made us freeze. That night's 4-day trip turned into a 1-day forced march back to the trailhead. By mid-afternoon, we reached our cars, exhausted and still shaken. Once we got back to cell service, Jamie started researching. He found some researchers who documented Sasquatch encounters and sent them our photos and detailed accounts of what happened. They seemed genuinely interested, especially in the container damage and footprint measurements. One researcher told us that what we described, the deliberate manipulation of the containers, the obvious intelligence behind accessing the food, was consistent with other reports they'd received. He said bears attack food containers differently, usually with brute force, or by dragging them away to work on them. What we described suggested problem-solving ability and dexterity. It's been years now, and we still go camping, but things changed after that night. For the first 3 years, none of us would do backcountry trips in remote areas. We stuck to established campgrounds with lots of other people around. Even now, we're more cautious about where we set up, always making sure we have clear sightlines and escape routes. I've replayed that night in my head countless times. The silhouette in the moonlight, the deliberate movements, the deep breathing, the impossible footprints. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear walking oddly, or maybe some very tall human messing with us. But then I remember the containers, those reinforced, certified bear-proof containers, torn open like they were made of cardboard. No person could have done that with their bare hands, and no bear moves or behaves the way that thing did. I don't know what we encountered that night in Glacier National Park. I just know it was intelligent enough to target our food, strong enough to break equipment designed to resist wild animals, and cautious enough to keep its distance from us. Whatever it was, it knew exactly what it was doing. And that's what scares me the most to this day. Story 3. I still get chills thinking about what happened that night in '77. Even now, 40+ years later, I can close my eyes and see that thing standing there, watching us drive past. Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I can smell that awful stench again. It was October of '77, and me and 2 buddies were driving through the Davis Mountains in southwest Texas. We were towing a car back to Midland, a beat-up Chevy that my friend's brother had abandoned after it broke down on him. The whole trip had been uneventful until about 10 in the evening. The Davis Mountains aren't like other mountain ranges. They're these ancient volcanic remains, creating this rough, desolate landscape that feels prehistoric somehow. At night, it's a whole different world. The highway through there is this narrow 2-lane strip that twists and winds through hills and valleys. No streetlights, hardly any reflectors, and back then, not many guardrails either. When the sun goes down, your headlights only show you what's directly ahead, and the rest is just this inky blackness pressing in from all sides. I was driving the lead vehicle, a '72 Ford pickup, with my buddy Pete riding shotgun. Our friend Mike was following behind us in his truck, which was towing the Chevy. We'd been driving for hours at that point, and conversation had pretty much died. Pete was half asleep against the passenger window, and I was just focused on keeping us on the road while fighting my own exhaustion. The radio wasn't working too well in those mountains, just static and fragments of country stations, fading in and out, so it was mostly silent, except for the humming of tires on asphalt and the laboring sound of the engine as we climbed the inclines. It must have been around 10 when we came around this bend, and I spotted something by the side of the road. At first glance, I thought it was a saguaro cactus. You know how those things can look kind of human in the dark, but something about it made me slow down. I remember Pete sitting up, suddenly alert. "You see that?" he asked, pointing. I nodded, easing off the gas until we were crawling along at about 35 miles per hour. I flipped on the high beams, and that's when I realized what I was seeing wasn't a cactus at all. It was something standing there, right at the edge of the road. As we got closer, I could make out more details, and my blood ran cold. This thing was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It had this weird stooped posture, like its shoulders were permanently hunched forward. The head was huge compared to its body, not like a normal human proportion at all. And the eyes, God, the eyes were large and seemed to reflect our headlights, but not like an animal's eyes do. It was different somehow. The entire body was covered with this thick, long hair. Not fur exactly, but hair. Like really coarse human hair, but longer and more matted. It hung down from its arms, which were unnaturally long. Those arms must have reached almost to its knees. Pete was dead silent beside me, just staring. I could hear my own breathing getting faster, and I had this weird urge to both speed up to get away and slow down to get a better look. I compromised by keeping that steady 35 as we approached, and then passed it. The thing didn't move. Not a step, not a turn of its head, nothing. It just stood there, staring at us as we drove by. That stillness was somehow worse than if it had jumped at the truck or ran away. It was like it was studying us, memorizing us. And then the smell hit us. I had the windows cracked a bit for air, and as we passed, this overwhelming stench flooded the cab. It was like rotting garbage left in the sun for weeks, mixed with something musky and animal. Pete gagged and quickly rolled up his window. I did the same, but that smell had already gotten in and seemed to stick to the back of my throat. As we passed it, I checked the rearview mirror and could see Mike's headlights illuminating the creature from behind now. The silhouette was unmistakable. No way it was a bear standing up or some other animal. This thing had a distinctly humanoid shape, but wrong in all sorts of ways. Once we were about 100 yards past it, Pete finally spoke. What the hell was that? His voice was shaking. I didn't answer right away because I honestly had no idea what to say. We drove in silence for another minute or so, until I saw Mike flashing his lights behind us, signaling for me to pull over. I found a slightly wider section of road and pulled onto the narrow shoulder. Mike parked behind us, and before I even got out of the truck, I could see him jogging up, his face pale in the moonlight. "Did you guys see that?" he asked as soon as we stepped out. His hands were visibly trembling as he lit a cigarette. Pete nodded. "The big hairy thing by the road? Yeah, we saw it." "What was it?" Mike looked back the way we'd come, as if expecting the creature to be following us. I shrugged, trying to act calmer than I felt. "Bear, maybe? Standing on its hind legs?" Mike shook his head firmly. "No way that was a bear. Bears don't stand still like that, and did you smell it?" "God, yes," Pete said, wrinkling his nose like he could still smell it. "Truth is, I think we all could. We stood there on the side of that dark highway, discussing what we'd seen. The details matched exactly across all three of us. The height, the stooped posture, the oversized head, those eyes, the long arms, and the thick hair covering its entire body. And of course, that ungodly smell. "Should we go back?" Mike suggested, though he didn't sound enthusiastic about the idea. I remember this cold feeling washing over me at the thought of turning around and driving past that thing again. "And do what exactly?" I asked. Pete was already shaking his head. "No way. I vote we keep going." None of us wanted to admit we were scared, but we all were. Something about that creature had triggered a primal fear in me that I'd never felt before or since. It wasn't just that it was big or strange looking. There was something deeply unnatural about it, something that didn't belong in our world. We decided to continue on to Midland without stopping again, unless absolutely necessary. We got back in our vehicles, and I noticed both Pete and I kept checking the side mirrors, scanning the darkness behind us. For the next hour or so, we drove in complete silence. I kept replaying the image of that thing in my mind, trying to make sense of it, the way it stood there, so still, just watching us. It was like it knew we were coming, like it had positioned itself there specifically to be seen. Around midnight, we stopped for gas at a small station just outside Fort Stockton. As we filled up the tanks, we finally started talking again, our voices low, like we were afraid of being overheard. "You ever heard of Bigfoot sightings in Texas?" Pete asked. I shook my head. I thought that was more of a Pacific Northwest thing. Mike leaned against his truck. "My uncle swears he saw something like this when he was hunting near the big thicket back in '65. Said it was at least 8 feet tall and moved through the brush without making a sound." "This thing wasn't moving, though," I pointed out. "It was just standing there." "That's what makes it worse," Pete said quietly, like it wanted us to see it. The gas station attendant, an older guy with leathery skin, must have overheard us because he wandered over. "You're talking about seeing something strange tonight." We exchanged glances, and Mike nodded. "Back in the Davis Mountains, big hairy thing by the road." The old man didn't look surprised. "Folks call it the Davis Mountains Devil around here. Been sightings for years, but nobody likes talking about it much. Bad luck." He wouldn't elaborate further. just went back inside the station. His casual acceptance of what we'd seen somehow made it more real and more terrifying. We made it to Midland around 2 in the morning. Despite being exhausted, none of us wanted to be alone, so we crashed at Mike's place. We stayed up till dawn, drinking beer and talking about what we'd seen, comparing details over and over like we were trying to convince ourselves it had really happened. The next morning, in the harsh light of day, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank. Maybe it was some undiscovered species of ape. Maybe we were all just tired and saw something ordinary, but misinterpreted it in the dark. But none of those explanations felt right. The details were too clear, too consistent across all three of us. And that smell, you can't imagine something like that. In the weeks that followed, I did some research. Turns out there have been scattered reports of similar creatures in remote parts of Texas going back decades. Most people call them Bigfoot, but the descriptions vary. Some talk about creatures that sound almost human, except for their size and the hair. Others describe something more bestial. What we saw was somewhere in between, humanoid but definitely not human. I've never gone back to the Davis Mountains. I've had opportunities over the years, but something always held me back. It's like my subconscious is protecting me, warning me away. The strangest part is how that single encounter changed how I see the world. Before, I thought I understood what was real and what wasn't. Now I'm not so sure. If that thing exists, what else might be out there that we don't know about? Sometimes when I'm driving on dark rural roads, I catch myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that tall, stooped figure standing there watching. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can catch a whiff of that same putrid smell. I've told this story to very few people over the years. Most would think I'm crazy or was just seeing things. But Pete, Mike, and I know what we saw. 3 grown men, all seeing the exact same impossible thing at the exact same time. That's not a hallucination or a trick of the light. Whatever it was that stood by that lonely stretch of highway in the Davis Mountains that October night in '77, it was real. And somewhere out there, it's probably still watching and waiting for the next car to come around the bend. Story 4. It was August of 2005. I was 22, home from college for the summer and hanging with my childhood buddies. We'd been playing in this recreational softball league all summer. Nothing serious, just an excuse to get together once a week, knock some balls around, and drink cheap beer afterward. That particular evening, we just finished a game at the community field about a mile from Ryan's house. We hadn't played particularly well, but we didn't care. It was a beautiful Pacific Northwest evening, the kind where the sun hangs low, but it stays light until nearly 9 o'clock. The air had that perfect balance where it's not too hot, not too cool, just comfortable enough to make you want to sit outside and soak it all in. Ryan's parents weren't home. They'd gone to visit his sister in Portland for the weekend, so we crashed at his place after the game. His backyard backed up against this dense patch of woods that stretched up a decent-sized hill. Not quite a forest, but substantial enough that you couldn't see through it to whatever was on the other side. Just typical Washington state scenery, lots of tall evergreens, ferns, and that thick underbrush that grows everywhere around here. We were sitting on these plastic chairs on Ryan's back patio, still in our dusty softball uniforms, passing around a bag of chips and recounting the game's highlights. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and that blue-gray dusk was settling in. Ryan's yard had those solar-powered path lights that were starting to glow as the natural light faded. The only other illumination came from the kitchen light spilling out through the sliding glass door behind us. I remember taking a swig from my beer when Kelly suddenly stopped mid-sentence. She was facing the back of the yard, toward the small shed where Ryan's dad kept his lawnmower and garden tools. "Do you guys see that?" she asked, pointing toward the tree line beyond the shed. At first I didn't see anything, then I noticed what looked like small lights moving in circles high up in the evergreens. Not like flashlights, more like floating orbs the size of golf balls, maybe 5 or 6 of them, glowing a soft yellowish white. They were moving in these weird circular patterns, almost like fireflies, but much larger and more deliberate in their movements. "What the hell is that?" Ryan asked, standing up for a better look. I remember having this immediate feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a sudden awareness that what we were seeing wasn't normal. The lights continued their circular dance for maybe 30 seconds, then suddenly blinked out all at once. We all just stood there, staring into the darkness, trying to process what we'd seen. That's when Ryan went inside to grab a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. "Probably just someone with drones or something," he said when he came back out. But his voice had that forced casualness people use when they're trying to rationalize something. Kelly had moved to the edge of the patio, peering into the darkness. "I don't think those were drones, Ryan." I was about to suggest we go inside when I noticed something moving near the ground by Ryan's dad's wheelbarrow. The wheelbarrow was propped against the side of the shed, maybe 40 feet from where we were standing. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or maybe a neighbor's dog that had gotten loose, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized whatever was moving was much larger than that. Then it crawled out from behind the wheelbarrow, and I felt my entire body go cold. The creature was crouched low to the ground, but even hunched over, I could tell it was massive. It had short, golden tan hair covering its body, not fur exactly, more like a short coat that caught what little light there was. But what froze me in place was its face. Its face was wrong. It was almost human-like, but bare of hair, with features that were recognizable yet distorted, and its expression, I'll never forget it, looked shocked, like it was just as surprised to see us as we were to see it. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds, we all just stared at each other. The creature. Us, the creature. Nobody moved. I couldn't even breathe. Then Ryan's flashlight clicked on, and the beam caught the thing full in the face. Its eyes reflected the light, not like a deer's eyes, but with an unnatural yellowish glow that made my skin crawl. That's when it moved. 1 second it was crouched by the shed. The next, it was bolting uphill on all fours with a speed that defied belief. I've seen deer sprint through woods. I've seen cougars on nature documentaries. This thing moved faster than anything I've ever witnessed, its massive shoulders wider than its hips by a significant margin, bunched and flexed as it propelled itself forward. Its legs were shorter than its arms, but incredibly powerful, driving it up the incline like it was nothing. What happened next still doesn't seem possible. The thing reached the shed, which was maybe 6 feet tall, and instead of going around it, it leaped, not just over the shed, but cleared it with room to spare, landing somewhere in the brush beyond, before disappearing into the tree line. The whole encounter, from the moment we spotted it to when it vanished, couldn't have lasted more than 10 seconds. But in those 10 seconds, everything I thought I knew about the world shifted. We all just stood there, Ryan's flashlight beam still pointed uselessly at the now empty space where the creature had been. Kelly was the first to speak. Did you guys see that?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, like she was afraid the thing might hear her. Ryan lowered the flashlight slowly. "What the fuck was that?" he said, his voice cracking slightly. I couldn't form words. My mouth was dry, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I had this overwhelming sensation of being watched, like there were eyes on us from the darkness beyond the yard. "We should go inside," I finally managed to say. But Ryan was already stepping off the patio onto the grass. "I want to see where it went." "Are you fucking insane?" Kelly hissed. "We need to call someone." "Call who?" Ryan asked, still moving toward the shed. "The cops? And tell them what? That we saw Bigfoot in my backyard?" The word hung in the air between us. Bigfoot. None of us had said it until then, but that's what we were all thinking. Not that I'd ever believed those stories before. But what else could it have been? It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person in a costume. It moved with a fluid, powerful grace that seemed impossible for its size. "Ryan, don't," I warned, but he kept walking, sweeping the flashlight back and forth across the yard. Kelly and I looked at each other, and something in her expression made my stomach drop. Pure, unadulterated fear. I'm sure my face showed the same. After a moment's hesitation, we followed Ryan, staying close together. The grass felt different under my feet now, like I was walking on something alien. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. Ryan reached the shed and shone his light behind it, illuminating the area where the creature had jumped. The underbrush was disturbed, several ferns crushed flat. He moved the beam upward into the trees, but there was nothing to see but darkness between the trunks. "Look at this," he said, kneeling down. Kelly and I approached cautiously. In the soft soil behind the shed, there was an impression, a footprint, but unlike any I'd ever seen. It was huge, maybe 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toe marks. But it wasn't a bear print. It was too narrow, too structured, almost like a massively oversized human foot, but the proportions were off. "Jesus Christ," Kelly whispered. Ryan straightened up suddenly. "Did you hear that?" We all went still, listening. At first I heard nothing but the blood rushing in my ears. Then I caught it, a sound from up in the trees, not a breaking branch or rustling leaves, but a low, rhythmic humming, vibrating. I don't know how to describe it. It was almost mechanical but organic at the same time, like nothing I'd ever heard before. And then the lights were back. Those strange, glowing orbs floating among the upper branches, moving in their circular patterns, but this time they were closer, directly above us, maybe 30 feet up. That's when Ryan's patio light went out. Then his kitchen light. Then every light in his house and the neighboring houses. One by one, in a wave, like something was systematically killing the power. In the sudden darkness, the glowing orb seemed even brighter, casting an eerie, shifting light through the branches. I could see Ryan and Kelly's faces in that strange illumination, both frozen in expressions of disbelief and terror. "We need to go," I said, grabbing both their arms. "Now!" We backed away from the shed, never taking our eyes off those lights. As we reached the patio, I heard a sound from the tree line that made my blood freeze, a low, rumbling vocalization that was neither animal nor human. It vibrated in my chest cavity, making me feel physically ill. We didn't discuss our next move, we simply ran. Through the house, out the front door, into Ryan's car. He fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly he could barely get them into the ignition. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked back at the house. Through the windows, I could see those lights moving through the backyard, circling lower now. We drove straight to a 24-hour diner about 5 miles away and sat in a booth until sunrise, barely speaking. What was there to say? We'd seen something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, especially not in a suburban backyard in Federal Way, Washington. The power came back on about an hour after we left, according to the waitress, who mentioned a brief outage. But we didn't go back to Ryan's house until morning. When we did return, in the harsh light of day, there was nothing to see. The footprint behind the shed had been disturbed, probably by raccoons or neighborhood cats. There was no other evidence of what we'd witnessed. The woods beyond the yard looked normal, peaceful even. We never spoke about what happened. Not for almost a year afterward. It was like we'd made an unspoken pact to pretend it never occurred. Ryan moved out of that house 3 months later. Kelly transferred to a college on the East Coast the following semester. I stuck around, but I never went into those woods again. I still can't explain what we saw that night. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was some kind of mass hallucination, brought on by exhaustion or maybe something we drank. But then I remember the way that thing moved, the impossible speed and grace of it. The way its face looked almost human, yet fundamentally wrong. And those lights. I've researched similar encounters since then, and while there are stories about Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest, none of them quite match what we experienced. Most descriptions mention dark hair, not the golden tan color we saw, and none mention those strange lights or the power outage. All I know is that something was in those woods behind Ryan's house, something that shouldn't exist. And sometimes, late at night, I still wake up with the certainty that it's watching me through my bedroom window, waiting to be seen again. Story 5. I've been holding this in for 14 years now, and I need to get it off my chest. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that night in July 2009, when I was leading a Boy Scout expedition in Quetico Provincial Park. For those who don't know, Quetico is this massive wilderness area in Ontario, right across the border from Minnesota's boundary waters. We're talking about a place roughly the size of Connecticut, but with no roads, no buildings, no cell service, just lakes, forest, and wildlife. I'd been there several times before, but this trip was special because my son Andy was finally old enough to come along. Our group consisted of 6 scouts and 3 adults. We had spent the first day paddling and portaging between lakes until we reached our campsite on Inlet Bay. The first night was perfect, clear skies, good fishing, no problems, but everything changed on that second day. During the afternoon, my nephew, one of the scouts, and I had separate experiences that I initially dismissed. I was gathering firewood about 50 yards from our camp when the hair on my neck suddenly stood up. The forest had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no squirrels chattering, nothing. Just this overwhelming feeling that I was being watched. I turned in a complete circle, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. Still, I hurried back to camp with only half the wood I'd planned to gather. Later, my nephew came back from a short hike looking pale. When I asked what was wrong, he just shrugged it off, saying, "Nothing, just felt weird out there." It wasn't until after everything happened that he admitted he'd had the same sensation, like something was stalking him through the woods. That evening, we had a good dinner of fresh walleye that the boys had caught. As darkness fell, we gathered around the campfire. Our site was on a small peninsula with water on 3 sides and dense forest on the 4th. The night was warm but not hot, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes down. The lake was like glass, reflecting the almost full moon. There were 7 of us still awake around the fire: myself, Andy, my nephew, another adult leader named Jim, and 3 other scouts. The younger scouts had already crashed in their tents. We were just talking about the day's canoeing and telling the usual campfire stories when Andy suddenly raised his hand. "Everyone be quiet," he whispered. We all froze. At first, I heard nothing but the crackling fire and the light lapping of waves on the shore. Then I heard it, movement in the brush at the edge of our campsite, maybe 30 yards from the fire in the direction of the forest. Something big was out there, moving slowly through the underbrush. This wasn't a small animal. The sound of twigs snapping and leaves crunching was too heavy. Whatever it was substantial. My first thought was bear, which wouldn't be unusual in that area. But as we listened, I realized the footfalls had a rhythm that didn't match a 4-legged animal. The steps were deliberate, like something walking on 2 legs. "Jim," I whispered, "get the flashlights." He reached into his pack and handed out our high-powered LED flashlights. When we shined them toward the sounds, we saw nothing but the reflection of eyes would have shown up. The sounds stopped immediately when the lights hit the trees, but resumed once we lowered them. What was most unsettling was the pattern. This thing, whatever it was, seemed to be pacing back and forth just beyond the reach of our lights, as if it was studying us, but didn't want to be seen. Back and forth, always staying in that zone of darkness, beyond where our lights could penetrate effectively. Andy, who was 13 at the time, scooted closer to me. "Dad." "What is that?" he whispered. Probably a moose, I said, trying to sound confident. But I knew it wasn't a moose. Moose don't pace like that. They either move through an area or they don't. After about 15 minutes of this, we heard something that sent ice through my veins. Breathing, deep, labored breathing that seemed to come from something with massive lungs. It was low and throaty, not like a person, but not like any animal I was familiar with either. And I've encountered plenty of black bears, moose, and even the occasional wolf during my years of wilderness camping. One of the scouts, a kid named Kevin who was 14, and on his first big wilderness trip started shaking. "I want to go to my tent," he whispered. "We should all stick together," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. By this point, Jim had grabbed the camp axe and was holding it at his side. My nephew, who was 16 and had always been the most level-headed of the boys, was scanning the darkness with his flashlight in slow, methodical sweeps. "Mr. Harper," he said quietly, using my last name as the scouts typically did, "I don't think it's a bear." "What makes you say that?" I asked, still hoping it was just some curious wildlife. "Bears don't walk like that," he said. "That's walking like a person." He was right, and hearing him say it out loud made my stomach drop. The footsteps had a distinctly bipedal rhythm. Whatever it was out there, it was on two legs. We sat there for another 30 minutes, the fire slowly dying down, all of us too afraid to move away to get more wood. The thing continued its patrol, occasionally stopping for long periods where we could only hear that deep breathing. It never made any aggressive moves toward us. It never growled or huffed or made any threatening sounds. It just observed, and that was somehow worse than if it had charged us. Around 11 at night, the younger scouts in the tents started calling out, asking what was happening. I didn't want to scare them, so I called back that everything was fine. We were just enjoying the fire. But my voice must have betrayed me because one of them asked if there was a bear in camp. "Just stay in your tents," I said. "We're handling it." By midnight, the creature, I don't know what else to call it, had been circling our camp for over 2 hours. My initial fear had given way to a strange sort of tension. It hadn't done anything threatening, but its persistence was unnerving. "I think we should try to sleep in shifts," I finally told the group. 2 people stay awake while the rest go to their tents. We'll rotate every 2 hours. No one was excited about the idea of going to their tents with that thing still out there, but we were all exhausted from the day's paddling, and the adrenaline could only keep us going for so long. Jim and I volunteered to take the first watch, and everyone else reluctantly headed to their tents, walking in tight groups with flashlights swinging wildly at the darkness. Once it was just Jim and I, we built up the fire again and sat back to back so we could watch in all directions. For about an hour, we heard the same pattern of movement, always keeping its distance. "What do you think it is?" Jim whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "Not a bear, not a moose." "Sasquatch?" He said it half jokingly, but there was an edge to his voice. I just shrugged. I'd never believed in Bigfoot or any of that stuff, but sitting there in the darkness of Quetico with something unknown circling our camp, I wasn't ready to dismiss anything. Around 1 in the morning, something new happened. In the distance, maybe a mile or 2 away, we heard wolves howling. This wasn't unusual. There are plenty of wolf packs in Quetico. But what happened next stopped my heart for a beat. From the direction where our visitor had last been heard came a responding howl. But this wasn't a wolf howl. It was deeper, more resonant, and it carried over the lake like thunder. It was so powerful that it seemed to vibrate in my chest, and immediately after it, the wolves fell silent. "Did you hear that?" Jim whispered, his face pale in the firelight. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The howl had been unlike anything I'd ever heard in all my years in the wilderness. Years later, when I heard a recording of the famous Ohio howl on some Bigfoot documentary, my blood ran cold. It was identical to what we heard that night. The creature howled twice more over the next hour, each time fainter, as if it was moving away from our camp. After the third howl, we didn't hear the footsteps or breathing anymore, but neither of us slept that night. We kept the fire burning until dawn, jumping at every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. When morning finally came, I felt hollow and drained. The boys emerged from their tents, bleary-eyed and asking questions that I didn't have answers for. While they ate breakfast, I took my nephew and Andy to search the perimeter of our camp. I was hoping to find tracks, something to explain what had happened, but the ground around our site was covered in thick moss and dense undergrowth that didn't hold impressions well. In a few places, we found areas where the plants had been crushed, as if something heavy had stepped there, but nothing clear enough to identify. "Dad," Andy said as we were searching, "that wasn't a bear last night, was it?" I looked at my son, considering whether to lie to protect him or tell him the truth. "No," I finally said. "I don't think it was a bear." "Then what was it?" "I don't know," I answered honestly, "but whatever it was, it didn't try to hurt us. It was just curious, I think." We cut our trip short after that. I told the boys it was because of an approaching storm system, but the truth is, none of us wanted to spend another night at that campsite. We packed up and paddled all day to reach our next planned stop, making sure we were well away from Inlet Bay before setting up camp again. We didn't have any more visitors for the rest of the trip, but I noticed the boys stayed closer to camp and no one volunteered to gather firewood alone. It's been 14 years since that night, and I still don't have an explanation for what we experienced. It wasn't a bear. I've encountered many black bears, and they don't move or sound like that. It wasn't a moose or a deer for the same reason. It wasn't a person. We were miles from the nearest entry point, and no human could have made that howl. Whatever was watching us that night in Quetico walked like a man, breathed like a beast, and had the power to silence wolves with its call. I've led many scout trips since then, but I've never returned to Inlet Bay. Some places once visited are best left alone. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I hear that deep, labored breathing outside my window, and I wonder if whatever it was is still out there in those vast northern forests, watching and waiting for the next group of visitors to its territory. Story 6. I'm still trying to come to terms with what I saw last May. I've always been a logical person, not one to jump to crazy conclusions or believe in the supernatural. I was about to graduate high school. For crying out loud, I wasn't some little kid seeing monsters in the shadows. But what I experienced that night has haunted me ever since, and I can't explain it no matter how hard I try. It was a Thursday night, and I'd been working on my final English project that was due the next morning. Typical me, leaving it until the last minute. My parents had gone to bed hours ago, and the house was completely silent, except for the clicking of my keyboard as I tried to finish this stupid essay about the Great Gatsby. Around 1:30 in the morning, I realized I needed my notes that I'd left in my truck. I'd been using index cards to organize my thoughts during study hall and had accidentally left them in my glove compartment. I was exhausted, running on energy drinks and determination, but I needed those notes to finish. Our house sits directly across from this small neighborhood park. It's nothing special, just some playground equipment, a basketball court, and a strip of woods that backs up to it. During the day, it's filled with kids and families, but at night it's completely deserted and only lit by a single street lamp at the entrance. I walked outside in my sweatpants and t-shirt, not even bothering with shoes since I was just making a quick trip to my truck in our driveway. The night was unusually quiet. No cars passing, no wind, not even the normal sounds of crickets or distant dogs barking. It was that eerie kind of silence that makes you notice it. I had just unlocked my truck and reached into the glove compartment when I heard it. The scream. God, that scream. It's hard to describe accurately, but it was unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. It was high-pitched but powerful, somewhere between a woman screaming and an animal howling, but wrong somehow. It lasted for what felt like forever, but was probably about 6 seconds. It wasn't continuous. It had this strange modulation to it, starting high, then dropping, then rising again before cutting off abruptly. Every single hair on my body stood straight up. I'm not exaggerating when I say I felt a physical wave of fear wash over me. My stomach dropped and I froze completely, index card still clutched in my hand. The scream had come from the direction of the park, and without thinking, I turned toward it. That's when I saw it. There was movement near the playground equipment, a dark figure moving across the park. At first, my brain tried to process it as a person because it was clearly walking on 2 legs. But as I focused on it, I realized several things at once that made my blood turn to ice. First, it was huge. I'm not great with estimating heights, but it had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. Second, it wasn't moving like a normal person. It had this strange loping gait, still bipedal, definitely not on 4 legs, but with a hunched posture and arms that seemed too long for its body. Third, it was moving fast, way too fast for something that big. The figure crossed the park in seconds, heading straight for the tree line at the back. I could make out the silhouette against the lighter background of the field. This massive, broad-shouldered shape that somehow moved with both power and a weird kind of grace. It didn't look like it was running from something. It looked like it was running towards something. When it reached the trees, it didn't slow down at all. It just plunged into the darkness and disappeared. The whole sighting lasted maybe 15 seconds total, but it's burned into my memory like a photograph. I stood there for what felt like forever, completely unable to move, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in, and I backed slowly toward my house, never taking my eyes off the tree line. I was terrified it would come back out, maybe heading toward me this time. Once I reached the front door, I practically fell inside, locked it behind me, and then went around checking every window and door in the house. I even woke up our dog, an old lab, who had slept through the whole thing. He seemed agitated when I got him up, whining and pacing, which only made me more scared. I couldn't sleep. I sat in my bedroom with the lights on, staring out my window at the park until the sun came up. I didn't see anything else move out there, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I told my parents what had happened. They exchanged that look. You know, the one parents give each other when they think you're being dramatic or making something up. My dad suggested it was probably just a homeless person cutting through the park, and my mum thought maybe I'd fallen asleep at my desk and dreamed the whole thing, but I knew what I saw, and that scream, that wasn't human. It wasn't any animal I recognized either. After school that day, where I turned in my half-finished English project and accepted the bad grade, I started searching online. I typed in descriptions of what I'd heard. High-pitched scream woods night, strange animal call human-like, stuff like that. And that's when I found it. A website dedicated to Bigfoot research had audio recordings of what they called samurai chatter and Ohio howls. I played one of the recordings and my blood went cold. It was the exact sound I'd heard, the same pitch, the same modulation, the same abrupt ending. I must have played it 20 times, and each time I got the same chills down my spine that I'd felt the night before. I'm not saying I saw Bigfoot, I'm not ready to make that leap. But I saw something that night that I can't explain, something that doesn't fit into what I thought was possible. And whatever made that sound wasn't human. For weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep properly. I'd jolt awake at the slightest noise outside my window. I started parking my truck closer to the house and never went out after dark if I could help it. I became obsessed with researching similar sightings in our area. Turns out, the woods behind our park connect to a larger forest that extends for several miles. There have been reports over the years of strange noises, livestock being spooked, And even a few missing pets. Nothing concrete, nothing that made the news, but enough to make me wonder. I graduated a few weeks later and started at Ohio State that fall. Being away from home helped. I wasn't constantly staring at that park and those woods anymore, but sometimes I still dream about it. In my dreams, I'm frozen in place while that figure emerges from the trees and comes straight toward me, moving with that same unnatural speed. The worst part is the uncertainty. If I'd seen a bear or even a mountain lion, though they're not supposed to be in our area, I could have processed that. But this was something that shouldn't exist. It walked like a human, but wasn't human. It was too big, too fast, moved too strangely. I've told this story to a few close friends, and they either think I'm making it up or that I misinterpreted what I saw because it was dark and I was tired. Maybe they're right. God knows I want them to be right, but deep down, I know what I experienced. Sometimes I find myself going down internet rabbit holes, looking at other people's accounts of similar encounters. There are so many out there, from all over the country. People who have heard those same screams, seen similar figures moving through the woods, people who, like me, have had their whole understanding of reality shaken. I went home for Thanksgiving break and found myself staring out at that park at night, half expecting to see that figure again. Nothing happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night is still out there, moving through those woods, making that terrible sound. I don't have any proof. No pictures, no video, nothing but my memory and the matching audio recording I found online. But I know what I saw and heard that night was real. And sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night in my dorm room miles away, I swear I can still hear that scream echoing in my head. What bothers me most is that I'll probably never know what it was. Was it really what people call Bigfoot? Some unknown species that somehow has remained hidden despite our world being mapped and documented to death? Or was it something else entirely? Something I don't even have a name for? All I know is that the world is stranger than we think. There are things out there we can't explain, things that don't fit into our neat categories of what should exist. I saw one of those things that night at the park, and I'll never forget it as long as I live. Story 7. I've debated for years whether to share this. Even now, typing this out makes my hands shake a little. It happened on December 26th, 1975, the day after Christmas. Some things you just can't forget, no matter how much time passes. This is one of those things. I lived in a small house outside Vaughan in Cascade County, Montana. Beautiful country, but isolated. My sister was visiting for the holidays. Our parents had passed a few years before, and we'd kept the family property. It was just the two of us that day. The morning after Christmas was cold as hell. Montana winters don't mess around. I remember the thermometer on the porch read 12 degrees below zero when I checked it that morning. The sky was clear though, which made for decent visibility across our property. We'd just finished a late breakfast, using up some of the leftover ham from Christmas dinner, when I noticed something wasn't right with the horses. We had 3 of them in the field about 100 yards from the house. They were huddled together, which wasn't unusual in the cold, but they were facing the woods and stomping. If you've been around horses, you know when they're spooked. These horses were definitely spooked. Something's wrong with the horses, I told my sister. She came to the window and watched them for a minute. Maybe there's a coyote or something, she suggested. I shook my head. They don't act like that for coyotes. They know coyotes. We kept watching. The horses were getting more agitated, not less. One of them reared up a bit and neighed. That's when I decided to grab my rifle from the gun cabinet, just a precaution. In those parts, you never knew what might come wandering onto your property. Bears, mountain lions, who knows? I'm going to check it out, I said, loading the rifle. You can stay here if you want. My sister, stubborn as always, pulled on her coat. Like hell I will. We bundled up, heavy coats, gloves, boots. and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit like a slap in the face. Our breath turned to clouds instantly. The horses were still acting up, even more so now. That's when I saw it. About 200 yards from the house, standing at the edge of the tree line, was something. At first I thought maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but bears don't stand that long, and this thing was just standing there, watching. It was huge, easily 7.5 feet tall, maybe more, and wide, not fat but broad, twice as wide as a normal man, easy. It was covered in dark hair or fur. "Do you see that?" I whispered. I didn't need to point. My sister's face told me she saw it too. "What the hell is that?" she whispered back, her voice shaking. My first thought was to get a better look. I raised the rifle, not to shoot, just to use the scope. Looking through it, I could make out more details. And that's when the real fear set in. The face was wrong. It wasn't human, definitely not, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen either. Not like a gorilla or an ape. The face was dark, almost blackish, set deep under a heavy brow. The eyes were what really got to me. They looked intelligent, aware, too aware. My hands started shaking. "Get back in the house," I told my sister. "What is it?" she asked again, not moving. "I don't know, but get back in the house." She didn't move. Neither did the creature. We were all just frozen there, staring at each other across the snowy field. The horses were going absolutely crazy now. I made a decision. I raised the rifle and fired a shot into the air, thinking it would scare whatever this thing was back into the woods. The sound cracked through the cold air like splitting ice. The creature didn't even flinch. It just stood there, still watching us. "What the hell?" I muttered. Any normal animal would have bolted at the sound of a gunshot. This thing just stood its ground. I fired another shot into the air. This time something happened that I still can't explain. The creature sort of lurched like it had been hit, even though I definitely didn't aim anywhere near it. It fell to its knees, then onto its side in the snow. My sister gasped. "Did you hit it? I thought you shot in the air." "I did," I insisted, feeling sick to my stomach. "I swear I did." We watched in horror as the thing started moving again. It wasn't getting up, though. Instead, it was pulling itself along with its arms, dragging its body through the snow toward the tree line. It moved like it was injured, but how could it be injured from a shot fired in the air? That's when things went from unexplainable to absolutely impossible. From the same spot in the woods where the first creature had been standing, 3 or 4 more emerged. I say 3 or 4 because it was hard to count them as they moved. They kind of blended together in their movements. But there were at least 3, possibly 4, and they looked exactly like the first one. Same height, same build, same dark hair covering their bodies. My sister grabbed my arm so tight it left bruises I'd find later. "Oh my God," she kept saying over and over. These new creatures moved quickly to the fallen one. There was purpose in their movements. Coordination. They weren't just wandering around. They went right to the injured one, and this is the part that still keeps me up at night sometimes. They helped it. 2 of them got on either side and lifted the injured one. Another seemed to be checking it somehow. Then, supporting the injured one between them, they retreated back toward the woods. It was like watching soldiers retrieve a wounded comrade. There was care there, intention, intelligence. They disappeared into the trees, moving surprisingly fast for their size, especially while carrying the injured one. My sister and I stood there for I don't know how long, just staring at the empty space where they'd been. The horses had finally quieted down, but they were still on edge, still facing the woods. "We need to go inside," I finally said, my voice not sounding like my own. We backed up to the house, neither of us willing to turn our backs on those woods. Once inside, I locked the door and pulled all the curtains closed. My sister was shaking so bad she couldn't hold her coffee mug when I tried to give her something hot to drink. "What were those things?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer then. I still don't, not really. What I saw doesn't fit with anything I know exists in this world. They weren't bears. They weren't gorillas, which wouldn't be in Montana anyway. They moved like humans, but they were not human. We stayed inside the rest of the day, jumping at every sound. I kept the rifle by the door. We took turns sleeping that night, neither of us wanting to be the only one awake if those things came back. They didn't come back, not that day or any day after. In the morning, I worked up the courage to go out and check the spot where the creature had fallen. There were indentations in the snow, but no blood, no hair, nothing I could point to and say, "See, this proves what we saw." My sister left 2 days later, earlier than planned. We've talked about it a few times over the years, confirming with each other that no, we weren't crazy. We both saw the same thing, but we don't bring it up much. What's the point? No one would believe us. I've read about Bigfoot sightings over the years. Some descriptions match what we saw, others don't. I don't know if what we saw were Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely. I just know they were real, they were intelligent, and they cared for their own. The part that haunts me most isn't their appearance, though that was terrifying enough. It's their behavior. The way they came to help the injured one, the coordination, the clear social bonds. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't mindless animals. They had society, relationships, compassion, and somehow that makes it more terrifying, because if creatures like that exist in our world, intelligent enough to care for each other, but completely unknown to science, what else might be out there that we don't know about? I still live in the same house. I've never seen them again, though sometimes when I'm out checking the property line or hunting, I get the feeling I'm being watched. The horses still act up sometimes, for no reason I can see. I've learned to go inside when they do. I don't tell this story much. People think you're crazy when you talk about seeing something like that, but I know what I saw. My sister knows what she saw, and sometimes that's all the confirmation you need. I fired into the air. I know I did. So how did that creature fall like it was hit? And why did the others come to help it? I've had 45 years to think about these questions, and I'm no closer to answers now than I was standing there in the snow, watching something impossible happen right in front of my eyes. Story 8. I've never told this story outside my immediate family, because I know how it sounds. Most people would think I'm making it up or that I was hallucinating, but I know what happened to me back in '64 was real. I was 32 at the time, clear-headed, and what I experienced changed my understanding of the world forever. It was the summer of 1964, July if I remember right. I'd been driving trucks for about 8 years by then, mostly lumber routes through Oregon and Northern California. The job was decent pay, but mind-numbing. Same roads, same stops, same everything. That summer, I decided to take 2 weeks off to go rock hounding and gem hunting in the Cascades, something I'd gotten into a few years before. There's something peaceful about being alone in nature, searching for little treasures that most people walk right past. I'd packed light, my tent, sleeping bag, fishing gear, some basic food supplies, and my rock hounding tools. Nothing fancy, just what would fit in my backpack. I drove out to a remote trailhead about 30 miles east of Oak Ridge and hiked in about 6 miles the first day. No real destination in mind, just wanted to get away from roads and people. By the third day, I'd moved deeper into the wilderness, probably 12 or 13 miles from where I'd left my truck. I was in a small valley with a clear stream running through it. Perfect spot for both fishing and finding interesting rocks in the stream bed. I'd set up camp under a stand of old Douglas firs, near enough to the water, but high enough that I wouldn't get flooded if it rained. That morning, I was making my way upstream, checking interesting rock formations along the banks, when I heard a strange sound, a sort of wheezing, labored breathing. Following the noise, I pushed through some underbrush and found a young deer, probably a yearling doe, lying on its side. There was an arrow stuck in her flank, just behind her ribcage. It wasn't a modern hunting arrow, but something more primitive looking, with crude fletching. I don't know who would have been hunting with equipment like that, especially out of season. The poor thing was terrified when she saw me, trying to get up but too weak to manage it. I approached slowly, talking softly like you would to a scared dog. "Easy, girl. I'm not going to hurt you. Let me help you." I've always felt comfortable with animals, and somehow this one seemed to understand I wasn't a threat. Using some rope from my pack, I carefully secured her to a nearby tree, just enough to keep her from bolting and hurting herself more. The arrow hadn't gone too deep, thankfully. I pulled out my first aid kit, always carry one when I'm in the backcountry, and sterilized my knife with alcohol. Then I carefully cut around the entry wound to make it easier to remove the arrow. The deer was surprisingly calm through all this, like she knew I was trying to help. Getting that arrow out was tricky. I had to be careful not to break the shaft inside her. When I finally pulled it free, blood started flowing pretty steadily. I pressed a clean bandana against the wound until the bleeding slowed, then packed it with some gauze and wrapped it as best I could with medical tape. Not exactly veterinary quality work, but it would help keep infection out while she healed. I left her tied loosely to the tree with enough slack to lie down comfortably, but not enough to run off and tear open the wound. I figured I'd check on her in a few hours, make sure she was okay, then untie her if the bleeding had stopped. It was around midday by then, so I decided to try my luck fishing. Caught 3 nice trout in a deep pool about a quarter-mile upstream from my camp. By the time I started heading back, the sun was getting low, casting long shadows through the trees. I was looking forward to cooking those fish over my campfire and then checking on the deer before dark. As I approached the spot where I'd left her, I noticed something odd. The deer was gone, but the rope was still tied to the tree, the knot intact. It looked like someone or something had untied it from the deer's side. I felt a prickle of unease, but figured maybe another hiker had come through and released her. That's when I sensed movement in the trees to my right. At first, I thought it was just branches swaying in the breeze, but there wasn't any wind. I focused my eyes, peering into the darkening forest, and gradually made out a shape. Something was standing upright among the trees, partially hidden behind a massive trunk. Something huge. My heart started hammering in my chest. Whatever I was looking at was easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and it was covered in hair, dark, thick hair all over its body. My first thought was bear, but no bear stands like that, with such a human-like posture. I was frozen in place, caught between the instinct to run and the knowledge that running from a predator is the worst thing you can do. My hand moved slowly toward the hunting knife on my belt. Not that it would do much good against something that size. And then it happened. Clear as day, I heard words in my head. "Don't be afraid, I'm not going to harm you." I almost fell over. The voice wasn't spoken aloud. It was inside my head, but it definitely wasn't my own thoughts. The voice had a different quality to it. Deeper, calmer, with a strange accent I can't really describe. The creature stepped forward from the trees, moving into a patch of fading sunlight. I got my first clear look at it, and there was no mistaking what I was seeing. It was a Sasquatch, what some folks call Bigfoot, about 8 feet tall, broad shoulders, massive arms hanging below its knees, and completely covered in dark brown, almost black hair. Its face was flatter than a human's, with a pronounced brow ridge, but the eyes were startlingly intelligent. They were watching me, studying my reaction. The creature came closer, stopping about 20 or 30 feet away. Then, in a surprisingly graceful motion for something so large, it sat down on a fallen log. Again, that voice in my head. "I just wanted to rest and sit for a while. I just want to be with you for a while." I stood there, mouth probably hanging open like an idiot. Then, without really thinking about it, I tried to respond, not out loud, but with my thoughts. "Who are you? What are you?" The creature tilted its head slightly, in an almost human gesture of consideration. "Your kind has many names for us." We are the old ones, the forest people. I realized I was having a telepathic conversation with a Sasquatch. Even now, decades later, I have trouble believing it happened, except that every detail is still so vivid in my memory. Cautiously, I moved to a rock about 20 feet from the log, where the creature sat, and lowered myself onto it. My legs were shaking so bad I had to sit down anyway. "You helped the young deer," the voice continued in my mind. "I watched you. Most of your kind would have killed it." "It was hurt," I thought back. "I couldn't just leave it suffering." The creature nodded slowly. "This is why I wanted to meet you. I have watched many of your kind in these forests. Usually when they interact with animals, they are killing them. Your actions were different." We sat there as the light continued to fade, communicating in this strange, silent way. I learned that the Sasquatch had been following me since I entered this valley, curious about what I was doing alone in the wilderness. It told me that there were others, a small family group, generally avoided humans but occasionally observed us from a distance. "Did you untie the deer?" I asked mentally. "Yes. She was well enough to move. The wound was not deep. She will live." I asked dozens of questions over the next 2 hours. Some it answered, others it seemed to avoid or not understand. I learned they don't use names the way we do. They recognize each other by something like a mental signature or feeling. They don't build permanent shelters, but use caves and natural formations. They gather plants and sometimes hunt, but never more than they need. The strangest part of all this was how quickly my fear disappeared. Within minutes of our conversation starting, I felt completely at ease. There was something gentle about this enormous creature, despite its intimidating size and strength. It wasn't threatening at all. It genuinely just wanted to understand me and perhaps to be understood. As night fell completely, I realized I should start a fire before it got too dark to gather wood. I explained this to my visitor, and it understood. Fire, it said, was something they respected, but did not use themselves. "Your hands are different," it communicated, and I realized it was referring to our opposing thumbs and dexterity. "You make things, we find things." The creature watched with interest as I built and lit my small campfire. The flickering light illuminated its features more clearly. Its face was more expressive than I'd initially thought, with subtle movements that conveyed curiosity and thoughtfulness. We continued our silent exchange for a while longer. It asked about my stone collecting, how it perceived my rock hounding, and seemed puzzled by the concept of collecting things purely for their beauty or interest. It asked about the loud-moving boxes, cars and trucks it had seen on distant roads, and why humans spent so much time in them. I tried to explain modern human life as best I could, but many concepts seemed completely foreign. Work, money, cities. These things had no parallel in its existence. It seemed to find our way of living unnecessarily complicated. As the night deepened, I cooked and ate my fish. I offered some to the Sasquatch, but it declined, communicating that it had already eaten earlier, berries and roots mainly. Throughout our exchange, I noticed the creature would occasionally tilt its head, as if listening to something in the distance that I couldn't hear. Eventually, after one of these moments, it stood up. "I must go now," the voice in my head said. "My family is calling." I stood too, feeling strangely sad that this incredible encounter was ending. "Will I see you again?" I thought. The creature seemed to consider this. "Perhaps. But it is better if your kind does not find us. Too many of you would not understand." It raised one massive hand in a wave, a gesture it must have learned from observing humans, and then turned and walked into the darkness of the forest. Despite its enormous size, it moved almost silently, far quieter than I could ever manage on the forest floor. Within seconds, it was gone from sight, disappearing among the trees as if it had never been there. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing, but the arrow I'd pulled from the deer was still there by my campfire, real, tangible proof that at least part of the day's events had definitely occurred. I didn't sleep much that night. How could I? I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, remembering the strange sensation of another being's thoughts mixing with my own. The next morning, I packed up camp and headed back toward civilization. I'd planned to stay out longer, but the encounter had left me feeling like I needed time to think. I never went back to that specific valley, partly out of respect for the creature's privacy, and partly because I was afraid I'd find nothing, that somehow the whole experience had been some kind of hallucination. But I know what I experienced was real. Sometimes at night I still dream about sitting by that campfire, communicating silently with a being that most people don't even believe exists. I've never been able to explain how the telepathy worked. Was it something they evolved as a species? Was I somehow special in being able to receive their thoughts? I don't know. But what I do know is that there are things in this world that science hasn't explained yet, and that the forests of the Pacific Northwest hide secrets most people will never glimpse. Story 9. I still get chills thinking about what happened that night at Trinity Lake. It's been over 14 years now, and I've never spoken about it publicly. My wife barely discusses it either, except when we occasionally revisit it between ourselves, trying to make sense of what we experienced. It was October 2009, early in the month. The fall colors were starting to show around Northern California, and my wife and I had decided to take a weekend drive up to Trinity Lake. We both needed to decompress from work stress, and driving through the mountains has always been our way of reconnecting and clearing our heads. That afternoon had been perfect. Crisp autumn air, hardly any tourists since the summer season was over, and the kind of silence you can only find when you're away from cities. We'd spent most of the day just driving around the lake, stopping at viewpoints, eating sandwiches we'd packed. Nothing planned, just going wherever the road took us. As the sun started setting, we were on the northwestern side of the lake. I remember being a bit disappointed that we'd have to head back soon. We had about an hour and a half drive back to our hotel. That's when we noticed this unmarked dirt road veering off the main route. My wife suggested we check it out, maybe find one last good view of the sunset over the water before heading back. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for our Honda Civic, with branches scraping against the sides. It wasn't maintained at all. Definitely not a regular tourist spot. After about half a mile of slow driving, the trees opened up to reveal this small clearing that overlooked a secluded cove of Trinity Lake. The view was incredible, the water reflecting the orange and pink sky, mountains silhouetted in the distance. We shut off the engine and just sat there, windows down, taking it all in. In retrospect, I should have been more alert to how isolated we were. No cell service, no other cars, no buildings in sight. Just us, the forest, and the lake below. The sun disappeared completely around 6:30, and darkness fell quickly, the way it does in the mountains. My wife suggested we should probably head back before it got too dark to navigate the dirt road. I agreed, but we lingered for just a few more minutes, watching the first stars appear. That's when we heard it. From somewhere in the tree line behind our car came this deep, guttural growl. Not like a dog or a mountain lion, much deeper, almost like it was coming from something with a massive chest cavity. The sound physically moved through me. My wife grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in. "What the hell was that?" she whispered. Before I could answer, another growl responded from the opposite side of the clearing. It was the same type of sound, but slightly different in pitch. My mind was racing. Mountain lions? Bears? But bears don't usually growl like that, and mountain lions make more of a screeching sound. My instincts kicked in. I reached for the key to start the engine, but my hand was shaking so badly I fumbled it. The growling continued, seeming to get closer. My wife was frantically rolling up her window. "Turn on the lights!" she hissed. I twisted the key and flipped on the headlights in one motion. What I saw still haunts me. Two sets of eyes reflected back at us from the tree line. One set on each side of the clearing. They weren't low to the ground like you'd expect from a four-legged animal. They were high up. I'd estimate at least 7 or 8 feet off the ground, and they were spaced unusually wide apart, wider than a human's eyes would be. My wife saw them too, and let out this strangled sound between a gasp and a scream. The eyes on the right side of the clearing blinked slowly, then seemed to move slightly higher, as if whatever it was had stood up straighter. I threw the car into reverse, planning to back up, turn around, and get the hell out of there. That's when it happened. Something, and I mean something, slammed into the back of our car with enough force to rock us forward several feet. The impact was so hard, I thought another vehicle had rear-ended us, but I knew that was impossible. My wife screamed outright this time. I twisted around in my seat to look through the rear window. In the red glow of our taillights, I saw it, broad shoulders easily wider than our car's trunk, a massive head that seemed to sit directly on those shoulders with barely any neck, and long, powerful arms reaching toward our car. Its face, God, I still see it when I close my eyes sometimes, was covered in thick dark hair or fur, but its eyes caught the reflection of our taillights and shone bright red, like burning coals. They weren't the reflective yellow you see in most animals' eyes at night. These were red, and they looked intelligent, aware. It opened its mouth and let out a roar so loud it actually rattled the glass in our windows. I could see massive teeth, not like a bear's, more like oversized human teeth, but sharper. The smell hit us even through the closed windows, like wet dog mixed with something rotten. Adrenaline took over. I slammed the car into drive and floored it, scraping past trees, not caring about the paint or potential damage. All that mattered was getting away. The dirt road seemed twice as long going out as it had coming in. Branches whipped against the windows, and twice we nearly went off the narrow path. I made the mistake of looking in the rearview mirror. Something was following us. I could see 2 glowing eyes bobbing in the darkness behind us, keeping pace with a car going at least 25 miles per hour on a rough dirt road. It wasn't running like a bear or a mountain lion. It was moving upright, taking huge strides. My wife was crying, frantically trying to get a signal on her phone. "What is it? What the fuck is it?" she kept saying over and over. I couldn't answer. I was too focused on not crashing while getting us out of there as fast as possible. The clearing had been quiet and peaceful just minutes earlier, and now we were running for our lives from... what? My brain kept rejecting the obvious conclusion. About halfway down the road, we heard another impact, this time against the right side of the car. The whole vehicle shuddered, and I fought to keep control. A second one of these things had flanked us through the woods and was now trying to stop us from the side. In the split second I looked right, I saw a massive arm swipe past my wife's window, long, covered in dark hair, with a hand that seemed too large to be real. My wife screamed again, pressing herself against me and away from the window. The sound it made wasn't a roar this time. It was almost like speech, but no language I'd ever heard. Deep, rumbling vocalizations that had pattern and intent behind them. The one behind us seemed to respond in kind. They were communicating. I pushed the car harder, ignoring the scrapes and bangs as we bottomed out on rocks and ruts. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and I was barely breathing. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only a minute or two, we broke out onto the paved road. I didn't slow down, didn't look for traffic, just turned hard and gunned it. In the rearview mirror, I caught one last glimpse of those eyes at the edge of the tree line, still watching us, still burning red in the darkness. We didn't stop until we hit the main highway, about 15 minutes away. I pulled onto the shoulder and we both just sat there, shaking, trying to process what had happened. The car was a mess, deep scratches along both sides and dents in the rear bumper and right passenger door. Not the kind of damage a branch could do. When I finally got out to inspect it, I found something that made my blood run cold. Embedded in one of the dents on the passenger door was a clump of coarse, dark hair, along with what looked like skin or tissue. Not fur like a bear's. This was more like incredibly thick human hair. I removed it with a tissue and we took it with us, thinking we might show it to a park ranger or someone who could identify it. But by the next morning, after a sleepless night in our hotel room with the furniture pushed against the door, we both just wanted to leave and never come back. We threw the hair away and drove home in silence. We talked about reporting it, but what would we say? That we were attacked by two massive, upright creatures that communicated with each other and moved faster than a car on foot? That they had glowing red eyes and hands that could dent metal? Who would believe that? Over the years, I've done research, trying to find any similar reports from that area. I've found a few vague accounts of hikers hearing strange vocalizations or feeling watched near Trinity Lake. A couple mentions of unusually large footprints. But nothing as direct or terrifying as what we experienced. The rational part of my brain still tries to explain it away. Maybe it was bears. Maybe we were tired and the light was playing tricks on us. But then I remember the intelligence in those eyes, the way they coordinated their attack, the almost human quality of those vocalizations. I haven't been back to Trinity Lake since that night. My wife and I still go on drives, but we stick to populated areas now, and we're always home before dark. Some nights I still wake up hearing that deep rumbling growl, feeling the car shake as something impossibly strong slams into it. Whatever was in those woods that night, it wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything that should exist in the rational world I thought I lived in, and the worst part, I'm convinced they let us go. They could have stopped our car completely if they'd wanted to. Instead, they escorted us out of their territory, making sure we knew never to return, and I never will. Story 10. I still can't sleep right when I think about what happened that night. This was about 3 years ago in the summer, but feels like yesterday. My buddy and I had been bullfrog hunting around the ponds near Ranger in Eastland County plenty of times before. Nothing fancy, just a couple of guys with .22 rifles looking to bag some frogs. It was something we'd done since high school, and we knew those woods like the backs of our hands. At least we thought we did. That night started off normal enough. We'd waited until dusk, since that's when the bullfrogs are most active. The air was thick with humidity, and you could hear the usual chorus of cicadas and crickets. Everything felt familiar, comfortable even. We'd parked my old pickup about half a mile back on a dirt road and hiked in with our rifles and flashlights. We were approaching this small pond, not much more than a watering hole really, tucked back in a little clearing. The moon was bright enough that we hadn't even turned on our flashlights yet. I remember the water was really still, like glass, reflecting the moonlight. I was just about to whisper to my buddy that I could see some movement at the pond's edge, probably our first frog of the night, when it happened. This roar. God, I don't even know how to describe it properly. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a cougar, not a bear, which aren't even supposed to be in that part of Texas anymore. Nothing like that. It was deep, guttural, and seemed to vibrate right through my chest. The sound just cut through everything else. The insects went silent instantly. We both froze mid-step. I felt the hair on my arms stand straight up. For a second, neither of us even breathed. Then my buddy whispered, "What the hell was that?" I couldn't even answer him. My mouth had gone completely dry. Then we heard it. A loud snap of a branch breaking, not like when you step on a twig. This sounded like someone had taken a baseball bat to a 2-inch thick branch. It came from the direction of the cedar trees that grew along the slopes surrounding the pond. I squinted, trying to make out what could have made that sound, when I noticed movement among the trees. At first I thought it might be the wind, but there wasn't any breeze that night. The air was dead still. Something was moving between the cedars, and then I saw it, Behind one of the larger cedar trees, something massive was swaying slightly from side to side, just barely visible in the moonlight. I couldn't make out details at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized I was looking at something covered in dark brown hair. Something huge. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. My buddy nodded, his face pale in the moonlight. "What is it?" Whatever it was, shifted position slightly, and that's when I got a better look at its size. This thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably taller, and it was wide, like linebacker wide, but even bigger, 4 feet across at the shoulders easy. The cedar tree it stood beside looked like a sapling in comparison. For a few seconds, we just stood there, paralyzed. Part of me wanted to believe it was just a weird shadow or my mind playing tricks, but deep down, I knew better. This was something real, something that shouldn't exist. "Let's hold our ground," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe we can get a better look, figure out what it is." I don't know why I said that. Curiosity maybe, shock, or maybe I just couldn't process what I was seeing. My buddy didn't share my curiosity. "Screw that," he hissed, and before I could stop him, he turned and bolted back the way we came. In that split second, I had a moment of clarity. We had 22 rifles, perfect for hunting frogs, but practically toys against whatever this massive thing was. A 22 would just piss it off, and now I was standing there alone, while this creature was watching me from the trees. I didn't need any more convincing. I turned and ran after my buddy. The moment I moved, I heard it too. Heavy, rapid footfalls behind me, not like a person running, more like something massive covering ground in powerful strides. The ground literally vibrated with each impact. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest. I caught up to my buddy quickly. Fear makes you run faster than you ever thought possible. We were sprinting through the woods, dodging trees and undergrowth, not even using our flashlights, just running on pure adrenaline and the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a loud thud behind us, followed by something heavy bouncing across the ground. Against every survival instinct, I glanced back over my shoulder. A boulder, was bouncing and rolling across the ground, kicking up dirt and leaves. This wasn't some pebble. This thing was the size of a basketball, maybe bigger, and it had been thrown with such force that it bounced like a tennis ball before smashing into a tree trunk with a sickening crack. The realization hit me like that rock would have if it had connected. Whatever was behind us had just hurled a massive rock with enough strength to potentially kill us if it had hit. No human could throw something that big, that hard, not even close. That's when true panic set in. We weren't being chased by a person. We weren't dealing with anything normal. This was something else entirely. We ran even faster after that, crashing through underbrush, ignoring the branches whipping our faces. I don't think either of us had ever moved that fast in our lives. My lungs were burning, my legs were on fire, but stopping wasn't an option. I kept expecting to hear another rock flying through the air, or those heavy footsteps getting closer, but at some point, I don't know exactly when, the sounds behind us stopped. Maybe it gave up. Maybe it was just toying with us. I didn't care. We just kept running. We finally burst out onto the dirt road where we'd parked the truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. The moment the engine started, we peeled out, throwing dirt and gravel everywhere. Neither of us spoke for a good 10 minutes as we tore down those back roads, the truck's headlights barely illuminating the way ahead. Finally, when we hit the highway and the lights of Ranger appeared in the distance, my buddy broke the silence. What the hell was that thing? His voice was shaking. I didn't have an answer then, and I still don't now, not really. But what I do know is what I saw, what we both saw. After we calmed down enough to think straight, we started talking about it more, trying to make sense of it. That's when my buddy mentioned something I'd completely forgotten about. The stories. For years, there had been rumors around Ranger about strange sightings in those woods. Most people wrote them off as tall tales or drunken exaggerations, the kind of stories people tell around campfires to scare each other. We'd heard them growing up but never paid them any mind. But now I believe every single one of them. I've spent countless hours since that night researching, trying to find an explanation for what we encountered. The size, the strength, the hair, all of it points to something that most people would call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. But knowing there's a name for it doesn't make it any less terrifying. What keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of seeing it. It's the intelligence it displayed. It wasn't just some animal reacting on instinct. It threw that rock deliberately with purpose. It was trying to hit us. It was thinking. We never reported it officially. Who would believe us? Two guys coming back from the woods with a wild story about a monster. We'd be laughed out of town. But we did quietly ask around and found out that there had been other sightings over the years. Hunters, campers, even a couple of high school kids who'd gone out there to drink beer. All of them described something similar. All of them had been too afraid of ridicule to come forward publicly. I haven't been bullfrog hunting since that night. Haven't been back to those woods at all, actually. My buddy moved away about a year later, said he couldn't stand living so close to those woods anymore. I don't blame him. I've thought about moving too. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced I've heard that deep roar again. Sometimes I think I see movement outside my window. Something large, swaying side to side. I know it's just my mind playing tricks on me, but still, I keep my doors locked, always. I don't know what's out there in those woods near Ranger. I don't know if it's still there, or if there are more of them. But I know what I saw. I know what chased us, and I know that most nights I still find myself listening for the sound of heavy footsteps or the thud of a rock being thrown with impossible strength. So, if you're ever out near Ranger in Eastland County, Texas, and you're thinking about doing some night fishing or hunting around those ponds, don't. Just don't. There are some things in this world that we're not meant to understand, and some creatures we're not meant to encounter. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I live with that knowledge every single day. Story 11. I still get goosebumps thinking about what I saw that night. It was Thursday, April 24th, 2003. The memory is burned into my brain like a brand. I was driving home from my late shift at the mill in Nacelle. For those who don't know, Nacelle is this tiny town in southwestern Washington, surrounded by endless forest. I'd been working there for almost 7 years by then, so the late-night drive home along Highway 4 was basically on autopilot for me. It was around 12:30 in the morning. No moon that night, just pitch black except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. I remember it was unusually cold for April, and I had the heater blasting. My old Ford pickup rattled a bit going up KM Hill. That steep stretch about 15 minutes outside town, I was exhausted. 10-hour shift that day. My eyes were heavy, and I was thinking about nothing but getting home, grabbing a beer and passing out. The radio was playing softly, some late-night talk show I wasn't really listening to, just background noise to keep me awake. I reached the top of KM Hill and started the descent when something caught my eye beyond the guardrail. At first, I thought it was just shadows playing tricks. God, I wish it had been. My headlights swept across the slope beside the road, and that's when I saw it. A massive figure walking downhill through the trees, walking on 2 legs, not stumbling or on all fours like a bear might be, walking deliberately like a person, but not a person. I immediately eased off the gas, slowing down without really thinking about it. The thing was maybe 30 feet from the road, moving parallel to it. I couldn't stop staring. It stood somewhere between 6 and 8 feet tall, hard to judge exactly in the dark and on the slope, but it towered over the undergrowth. The shoulders are what really got to me. Impossibly wide. Not like a person wearing bulky clothes or carrying something. The proportions were all wrong. It had this barrel chest, thick and solid like a weightlifter on steroids, but bigger, way bigger. The entire body was covered in hair. Not fur exactly, more like hair, longish, maybe 4 to 6 inches, and it moved slightly as the thing walked. Under my headlights, I could see the color clearly enough. A dark, bluish gray, not black, definitely not brown like a bear. This weird grayish blue that somehow reflected just enough light for me to notice. I've lived in these woods my whole life. I've seen pretty much every animal that lives here. I've seen bears standing on their hind legs. They have this narrow, sloped shoulder profile, and they're awkward when they stand. This thing wasn't awkward at all. It moved with purpose, with confidence, and it wasn't an elk or deer either. I've seen hundreds of them over the years. This was bipedal, massive, with shoulders that spread out at the top like an impossibly huge man. The arms were long, hanging down past what would be the waist on a human. My truck kept moving, of course. The whole sighting probably only lasted 3 or 4 seconds. But time did that weird stretching thing, you know, where a moment feels like it's playing in slow motion. Every detail burned into my retinas. I didn't see a face. It was in profile to me, moving away down the slope. I'm grateful for that now. I don't think I want to know what its face looked like. As I passed, I had this intense urge to slam on the brakes and back up, to get another look, to confirm what I was seeing, but some primal part of my brain overrode that curiosity with a flood of cold fear. I was alone, unarmed, middle of nowhere, past midnight. I actually sped up instead, pressed that gas pedal down harder than I needed to on that downhill stretch. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. I remember glancing in my rearview mirror, but the curve of the road and the darkness swallowed whatever it was. The rest of the 20-minute drive home is a blur. I don't even remember the turns or stops, just this buzzing in my ears and my heart hammering against my ribs. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, engine off, just trying to process what I'd seen. Inside my house, I didn't even grab that beer I'd been looking forward to. I double-checked all the locks instead, drew the curtains, sat on my couch in the dark. I felt ridiculous, a grown man, scared of shadows, but it wasn't shadows. I know what I saw. I've spent the last 20 years trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange that made its shoulders look different. Maybe it was some guys in the woods playing a prank with a costume. Maybe I was more tired than I thought and my eyes played tricks, but none of those explanations feel right. I know bears, I know elk, I know the wildlife around here like I know my own reflection. This was something else. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it was nothing, almost. But I couldn't shake the image of those proportions, that impossible width across the shoulders, the fluid way it walked on 2 legs down that steep slope in the dark. I called in sick that day, couldn't face driving back past that same spot so soon. When I finally did drive that route again 2 days later, I did it in broad daylight. I slowed down at the top of KM Hill, looking for, I don't know what. Footprints? Broken branches? There was nothing obvious from the road, and I sure as hell wasn't going to pull over and go searching in those woods. I never reported it officially. Who would I tell? The local sheriff would think I was drunk or crazy, but I did mention it to my buddy Rick, who works at the Forest Service. Just casually, like, hey, you ever hear about anything strange up on KM Hill? He gave me this look. Not disbelief, something else. Then he told me I wasn't the first person to see something up there. A couple of hikers back in the 90s claimed they found a deer carcass wedged high up in a tree fork, way higher than a cougar would drag it. Another guy camping alone packed up in the middle of the night after hearing bipedal footsteps circling his tent for hours. I've heard all the Bigfoot stories, grew up with them, always thought they were bullshit. Campfire tales to scare kids. I'm still not saying that's what I saw. I don't know what I saw. But I know it wasn't normal, wasn't natural. Since that night, I've developed this habit of scanning the tree line whenever I drive that stretch of road. Always in daylight now, I switched to day shifts the following month, told my boss it was for family reasons. The truth is, I couldn't handle that road at night anymore. Sometimes I think about going back there with a camera, maybe a rifle for protection, setting up somewhere with a view of that slope, waiting. But then I remember the way that thing moved, purposeful, strong, and I wonder what the hell I would do if it actually showed up. If it approached me. What good would a camera do? What good would a rifle do against something that size? The rational part of me says I should let it go. It's been 20 years, but the memory hasn't faded one bit. I can still see those wide shoulders, that barrel chest, the bluish-gray hair catching the light from my headlights. I can still feel that primal fear that flooded my system. I've read about other sightings since then. People describe similar things: the height, the shoulders, the way they move. Some reports mention glowing eyes or strange smells. I didn't notice either of those things in my brief encounter, but I wonder what else I might have seen if I'd had more time, or if it had turned to face me. The worst part is the not knowing. If I'd seen a mountain lion or a bear, I could catalog it and move on, but this exists in some gray area between known and unknown, between possible and impossible. I've tried talking about it a few times over the years. Most people either think I'm making it up, or they launch into their own theories about Bigfoot and cryptids and government cover-ups. Neither response helps. I don't want to be part of some conspiracy theory. I just want to understand what I saw. Last summer, I was fishing with my nephew at a lake about 10 miles from KM Hill. As the sun was setting, he pointed to the dense forest across the water and asked, "Uncle, you ever seen anything weird in these woods?" I nearly dropped my fishing rod. Asked him why he wanted to know. "Just curious," he said. "My friend's dad says he saw something big walking on two legs out near the logging road last month. Said it was too big to be a person." I changed the subject. What was I supposed to say? That yeah, these woods might hide something we don't understand, that there might be reasons to be afraid of the dark out here. I still drive that road several times a week, still live in the same house, still work at the same mill, though I'm a supervisor now. Life goes on, and mostly I don't think about it. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night and hear branches breaking in the forest behind my house, or when an unusually heavy footstep seems to shake the ground just slightly, I remember. I remember those few seconds on KM Hill, the massive silhouette, the impossible proportions, the deliberate movement, and I wonder if, as my headlights briefly illuminated that creature, did it turn to look at me too? Did it register my presence the way I registered its? Does it remember the human it glimpsed through the trees that night? Does it ever look for me the way I find myself still looking for it? Story 12. I've never told anyone about this, not a single person. I've rehearsed telling my closest friends 1,000 times in my head, but I always chicken out. They'd think I was crazy or making it up for attention, but it's been over 10 years now, and I still wake up in cold sweats some nights. I need to get this off my chest, even if it's just telling strangers on the internet. It happened in October 2013. I was 23, living in a small town in the Pocono Mountains in Pennsylvania. The fall colors were at their peak that day, bright reds and yellows everywhere. I'd spent the afternoon at my buddy's place about 3 miles from mine, playing video games and having a few beers. Nothing crazy. Around 6 in the evening, I decided to head home. My friend offered to drive me, but the weather was nice. That perfect fall temperature where you just need a light jacket. And I wanted some fresh air to clear my head. Plus, I knew a shortcut through the woods that would cut the journey down to about 2 miles. I'd taken this path dozens of times before. It was mostly well-worn, cutting through a section of forest between our neighborhoods. Parts of it ran along old logging trails. Other sections were just paths that locals had created over the years. Nothing special. Nothing scary. The sun was starting to set as I entered the woods. The light was getting that golden orange quality that filters through the trees in late afternoon. I remember checking my phone. It was around 6:30. I had maybe 45 minutes before it would be completely dark. But I wasn't worried. The path would take 30 minutes at most, even at a lazy pace. About 10 minutes into my walk, I realized how quiet it had gotten. And I don't mean peaceful quiet, I mean dead quiet. If you've spent time in forests, you know they're never truly silent. There's always something. Birds calling, squirrels rustling through leaves, wind in the branches. But suddenly there was nothing, just the sound of my own footsteps. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a hawk was nearby and the small animals were hiding. But then I noticed the air had changed too. There was this smell. God, I'll never forget it. Like a wet dog that rolled in something dead, mixed with this sour, musky odor. It wasn't overwhelming at first, just noticeable enough to make me wrinkle my nose. I picked up my pace a bit, not scared yet, just wanting to get home before dark. That's when I first heard it. Footsteps behind me. Not right behind me, but definitely on the path, crunching through fallen leaves. I stopped and turned around. Nothing there. The footsteps stopped too. "Hello?" I called out, feeling like an idiot from a horror movie. No response. I started walking again, a bit faster now. The footsteps resumed, matching my pace but staying the same distance behind me. When I stopped again, they stopped too. This happened 3 more times, and each time I would spin around, there was nothing there. Just trees and brush and the darkening forest. My heart was starting to race. I told myself it was just an echo somehow, or maybe a deer following at a distance. I've encountered plenty of wildlife on these trails before, deer, raccoons, even the occasional black bear. But bears make noise. They don't stalk silently and stop when you stop. The path ahead narrowed as it passed between a rock outcropping on one side and dense brush on the other. It was the most constricted part of the trail, maybe 10 feet wide at most. As I approached this section, the smell suddenly intensified. That rotting, musky odor was so strong I could almost taste it. About 20 yards ahead, right where the path narrowed, I saw it. Even now my hands are shaking as I type this. What I saw standing there was not a person. It was not a bear. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice as broad as mine. It was just standing there, partially obscured by the gathering shadows, but visible enough that I could make out its outline against the lighter background of the rock face. The shape was all wrong for any animal I know. It stood upright like a human, but was far too large and proportioned differently. And its eyes, God, its eyes. They were reflecting the dim light somehow, glowing a dull red. Not like a camera flash on an animal at night, but something else entirely, and they were fixed directly on me. I froze. Every instinct in my body was screaming to run, but I couldn't move. We just stared at each other across that short distance. The smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water. I heard a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a deep, rumbling breath. When it leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to move toward me, I finally broke from my paralysis. I started backing up slowly, never taking my eyes off it. My foot caught on a root and I stumbled, catching myself before I fell. That small movement seemed to trigger something because the figure shifted its weight forward. That was it. I turned and ran. I ran harder than I've ever run in my life. I didn't follow the path. I just crashed through the underbrush in the general direction I knew would lead to the road. Branches whipped my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't care. Behind me, I could hear it moving, not running exactly, but taking heavy steps that cracked branches and rustled through the forest much faster than any human could move. The sound of its movement wasn't right, too fluid for something so large, covering ground too quickly. I didn't look back, not once. I was too terrified of what I might see gaining on me. My lungs burned and my legs felt like rubber, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I had this overwhelming sense that if I slowed down even for a second, it would be on me. After what felt like forever but was probably only a couple of minutes, I burst out of the tree line onto the main road. I still didn't stop. I kept running along the shoulder until I reached the first houses of my neighborhood. Only then did I slow to a walk, gasping for breath, my shirt soaked with sweat, despite the cool evening air. I made it home and locked every door and window. I sat in my living room with all the lights on until dawn, jumping at every sound outside. I kept expecting to see those red eyes peering in through my windows, but nothing came. The next morning, I convinced myself I had overreacted. It must have been a bear, I thought. Maybe it was standing on its hind legs, which made it look taller. The red eyes could have been a trick of the light. The footsteps behind me might have been an echo or my imagination. That's what the rational part of my brain was saying. But deep down, I knew better. Bears don't stand 8 feet tall. They don't have that kind of shoulder structure. They don't move the way that thing moved. And they definitely don't have eyes that glow red in the twilight. A week later, I got up the courage to go back in daylight. I didn't take the shortcut through the woods. I stuck to the main roads and approached from a different angle. I found where I thought the encounter had happened, that narrow spot between the rocks and brush. There were broken branches all around, but that could have been from me crashing through the underbrush in my panic. What I did find, though, was a strange patch of ground where nothing was growing, just bare dirt in a roughly circular area about 6 feet across. And the smell was still there, fainter but recognizable. I've never taken that shortcut again. I moved away from the Poconos a year later, partly because I couldn't stand being so close to those woods anymore. I still go hiking occasionally, but always in open areas, always with other people, and never, ever at dusk. I've researched what I might have seen. Black bears are common in Pennsylvania, but this wasn't a bear. Some people talk about mountain lions, but they're officially extinct in the state. And anyway, this thing was bipedal and massive. I've read about folklore, the Jersey Devil, Bigfoot, and other creatures. Nothing quite matches what I saw. The closest descriptions come from Bigfoot accounts, but even those don't mention the red eyes or that distinctive smell. And nothing explains why it seemed to be following me before appearing ahead of me on the path. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Sometimes I don't even believe myself. But I know what I experienced that October evening in the Poconos. I know what I saw standing in that path, watching me with those glowing eyes. I know what chased me through the woods. And I know that whatever it was, it doesn't belong in our world. It's something that shouldn't exist but does. And the thought that keeps me up some nights is wondering how many other people have encountered it in those mountains, and whether they all were lucky enough to get away like I did. Story 13. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night in February 1977. It's been over 45 years, but I remember it like it happened yesterday. Some things just burn themselves into your memory, you know? And when something that unexplainable happens, well, it changes you. My husband Ray and I were staying at my father's farm in Drayton Valley, Alberta. Dad was away for a few days, so we were keeping an eye on things. It was cold as hell that February, the kind of Alberta winter night where everything freezes solid and the darkness feels absolute. It was about 1 in the morning. We'd been watching some late show on TV, nothing special, and were finally heading to bed. I remember I was tired and looking forward to crawling under the thick quilts. The farmhouse was old and drafty, and even with the heating, you could feel the cold seeping in through the walls. I'd just switched off the TV Ray was locking up, doing his usual check of the doors. The farm was quiet, that deep country quiet that city folks never really understand. No traffic noise, no neighbors, nothing but the occasional creak of the house settling and the wind whistling around the eaves. And then we heard it. God, I don't even know how to describe that sound. It wasn't human. It wasn't an animal I'd ever heard before. And I grew up on that farm. I knew what coyotes sounded like. I knew elk calls and moose and even the weird shriek a cougar can make. This wasn't anything like those. It was a scream, but not just any scream. It was powerful, primal, and absolutely terrifying. It started low and then rose to this pitch that made every hair on my body stand straight up. It echoed across the property, seeming to bounce off the trees and the frozen ground. I literally froze in place, my blood turning to ice. "What the hell was that?" Ray whispered. He'd gone rigid too, his hand still on the door lock. I couldn't even speak. That sound had stolen my voice. It felt like it had reached right into my chest and squeezed my heart. Ray moved first, heading straight to the front door. He pulled it open just a crack, peering out into the darkness. I remember finally finding my voice and whispering, "Don't go out there." "I just want to see," he said. But there was nothing to see. The yard light had burned out a couple days earlier, and my dad hadn't gotten around to replacing it yet. Plus, there was no moon that night. It was pitch black beyond our windows. The darkness outside was complete, like looking into an abyss. Ray grabbed his boots and started pulling them on. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice still shaking. "I'm going to check it out," he said, reaching for his coat. I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging in. "Are you crazy? Whatever made that sound is not something you want to meet in the dark. It's probably just—" he started, but I cut him off. "That wasn't a just anything, Ray. That wasn't human." I could tell he was torn between curiosity and common sense. Thank God common sense won out. He reluctantly took his coat off, but kept looking out the window, straining to see something, anything, in that impenetrable darkness. We stayed up for another hour, listening. The house felt different somehow. Every creak made me jump. I kept feeling like something was watching us, even though the curtains were drawn. Ray eventually got his rifle from the cabinet. Not that he had any intention of using it, but it made us feel a little safer. The scream didn't come again. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear, and we went to bed, though neither of us slept well. I kept jerking awake, convinced I'd heard something moving outside. When dawn finally came, I was already up. I'd been watching the sky lighten through the bedroom window, waiting for enough light to see what might be out there. Ray was up too, pulling on his boots before the sun had fully risen. "I'm going to look around," he said, grabbing his coat. This time I went with him. No way was I staying in that house alone after what we'd heard. The morning was crisp and cold, our breath forming clouds in front of our faces. Everything was covered in a fresh layer of snow. It must have fallen lightly during the night. We stepped off the porch, our boots crunching in the snow, and that's when we saw them. Footprints. But not just any footprints. They were huge, absolutely massive. They came from the direction of the tree line, passed right by the west side of the garage, only about 75 feet from our house, and continued through our property toward the swamp at the back. Ray and I just stood there, staring. I remember the silence was absolute. Even the birds weren't singing. "Jesus Christ," Ray finally whispered, kneeling down next to one of the prints. They were barefoot prints, 5 toes, a heel, just like a human foot, but they were 18 inches long. I'm not exaggerating. We measured them with Ray's tape measure from his truck. 18 inches long and between 5 and 6 inches wide, and they were deep. Whatever had made them was heavy, very heavy. We followed the tracks. They were evenly spaced, like whatever made them had been walking calmly, not running. They led through our property and into the swamp area, where the ground was frozen solid this time of year. About halfway to the swamp, we noticed something else. There was a large pine tree where the tracks paused. The snow around it was disturbed, as if something had stood there for a while. "Look at this," Ray said, pointing at the trunk of the tree. There were marks on the bark, about 8 feet up, higher than Ray could reach, and he's 6 feet tall. It looked like something had leaned against it, and there, stuck to the frozen bark, were several long, coarse hairs. I remember reaching out without thinking and carefully pulling a few free. They were dark, almost black, but with reddish-brown tips. They weren't like any animal hair I'd seen before. Not bear, not moose, nothing I could identify. They were thick and wiry. I took out my leather bag that I always carried and carefully stored the hairs inside. We continued following the tracks until they disappeared into the denser trees where the snow cover wasn't as complete. When we got back to the house, neither of us quite knew what to say. We sat at the kitchen table drinking coffee, going over what we'd found. "That scream," I finally said. It was like it was announcing itself, like it wanted us to know it was passing through. Ray nodded slowly. Maybe our light scared it. Maybe that's why it screamed, as a warning to us. I thought about that for a while, but it came so close to the house. 75 feet, Ray. It was practically in our yard. We spent the rest of the day in a sort of daze, checking and rechecking the doors and windows. That night, we made sure every light in the house was on. Neither of us mentioned it, but we were both terrified the thing would come back. When my father returned a few days later, I showed him the hairs I'd collected. He'd lived in those parts all his life and had heard stories. Not that he'd ever admitted believing them before, but when he saw those hairs and the way Ray and I looked, something changed in his expression. "There are things in these woods," he said quietly. "Things that were here long before us." Since that night, I've done research. I've read accounts from others who've heard that scream. Some call it a Bigfoot or Sasquatch. I don't know what name to give it, but I know what I heard and what I saw. Those footprints were real. Those hairs were real. And that scream, my God, that scream was definitely real. It's been decades, but sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night thinking I've heard it again. It's like my brain recorded it and plays it back when I least expect it. I've never told many people this story. Most would think I'm crazy, or that we were seeing things, but I know what we experienced. Something walked across my father's farm that night in February 1977. Something not quite human, but not quite animal either. I still have those hairs stored away in a small box. Sometimes I take them out and look at them, just to remind myself that it really happened. That for one brief, terrifying moment, our world crossed paths with something unexplainable. And sometimes on cold winter nights, when the moon is hidden and the darkness is complete, I find myself listening, waiting. Because whatever it was that walked through our farm that night, I don't think it was just passing through. I think it's always been there, in the deep woods, in the swamps, in the wild places. I think it's still out there, moving through the darkness, watching, waiting, and sometimes, when it wants to, letting us know it's there with that bone-chilling scream that, once heard, you never, ever forget. I wish I could tell you I've come to some understanding about what happened that night. That time has given me perspective or answers. But the truth is, I'm just as baffled now as I was then. All I know is what I saw and what I heard. And sometimes that's the most terrifying thing of all, to have the evidence right in front of you and still have no explanation for what it means. Story 14. I can't explain what happened to me last October. I've replayed it in my head 1,000 times trying to make sense of it, but I still can't. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or crypto stuff, but now I don't know what to believe anymore. I live on a small property about 20 miles outside of Prince George, BC. It's nothing fancy, just a modest house with a barn and enough land to keep a few animals. I've had goats for about 6 years now. Nothing special, just a small herd of 8 that I keep mostly as a hobby and for clearing brush. They're good animals, you know, simple, hardy, and they don't ask for much. That evening started like any other. It was early October and the weather was already turning cold. We get that crisp autumn chill early up here. The sun was setting around 6:30 and I headed out to do my evening check on the goats like I always do. Make sure they have water, that they're all accounted for, and secure the gate before it gets fully dark. I remember I was wearing my old flannel jacket and had a flashlight with me, though I didn't think I'd need it yet. The sky still had that deep blue twilight color to it, but the shadows were getting long. The goats were in their usual grazing area, about 100 yards from the house, near the edge of the woods that back up to my property. I was almost to the pen when I heard it. A loud thud, like something heavy had landed or fallen nearby. Then immediately after, this chorus of panicked bleating from the goats. Not the normal noises they make when they're just startled by a raccoon or something. This was different. There was real fear in those sounds. I started jogging toward the pen, thinking maybe a coyote had gotten in or a tree branch had fallen. As I got closer, I could see the goats all clustered at the far end of their enclosure, as far away as they could get from the section of fence nearest to the woods. That's when I noticed the fence. One section was sagging badly, like something had pushed against it. And there, standing in the shadows beside that damaged section, was something. Something massive. At first, my brain tried to make sense of it. A bear, maybe. We get black bears around here sometimes, but this was all wrong. It was too tall, too human-like in its posture. It was standing upright, easily 7 feet tall, maybe taller. I stopped dead in my tracks, about 30 feet away from it. What I saw next made my blood run cold. The thing had one of my goats, Penny. I think it was Penny. It had her by the back legs and was pulling her through the gap in the fence. The poor animal was struggling. But this creature had such a grip on her that she couldn't break free. I could see it more clearly now. It was covered in thick hair, not fur like a bear, but hair, dark brown that looked almost black in the fading light. Its body was massive, with incredibly broad shoulders and arms that hung unnaturally low, almost to its knees. The head was large, with what looked like a sloped forehead and wide jaw. I couldn't see its face clearly because it was partially hidden by hair, but what I could see didn't look like any animal I've ever encountered. I know what you're probably thinking. Why didn't I run? Why didn't I yell or try to scare it off? I've asked myself the same questions 1,000 times. The truth is, I couldn't move. It wasn't just fear, though God knows I was terrified. It was like my brain couldn't process what I was seeing, like my body just shut down. So I stood there, frozen, watching as this thing, this Sasquatch, because that's what it was, I'm certain of it now, pulled Penny through the fence. It wasn't frantic or rushed. It pulled with one steady, powerful tug, and the fence wire gave way enough for the goat to slip through. Then it turned. With Penny dangling from one hand, it turned and looked in my direction. I don't know if it saw me. I don't know if it cared. But in that moment I felt completely exposed, completely vulnerable, like a rabbit that spots a hawk but can't find cover. After what seemed like forever but was probably only seconds, it turned away from me and started walking toward the woods. It moved with these long, even strides that covered ground surprisingly quickly. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you might expect something that size to be. It was efficient, purposeful. Within minutes, it had disappeared into the trees, taking my goat with it. I don't remember exactly how long I stood there afterward. Eventually, the shock wore off enough that I managed to stumble back to the house. I locked every door and window. I grabbed my rifle from the safe and loaded it. I tried calling the RCMP, but hung up before connecting because what the hell was I going to tell them? That Bigfoot stole my goat. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep a wink. Every creak, every sound outside had me jumping. I kept picturing that thing deciding to come back. Maybe for more livestock, maybe for me. When morning finally came, I forced myself to go back out to check on the remaining goats. They were all huddled together in the corner of the pen, still visibly stressed. The fence was worse than I remembered. Bent wide open, the wire stretched and warped, and there, in the soft earth near the fence, were footprints. Not bear prints, not human prints either. They were massive, easily 15 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. They were pressed deep into the ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I spent the morning repairing the fence as best I could, making it stronger than before. I moved the goats to a pen closer to the barn, one with a more sturdy enclosure. For days after that, I stayed close to the house after dark. I carried my rifle whenever I went to check on the animals. I installed motion sensor lights all around the property. The thing is, I never saw it again. Not directly, anyway, but sometimes, in the weeks that followed, I'd find strange things. A gate that I know I'd closed would be open in the morning. Footprints that didn't match any known animal. And once, about a week after the incident, I heard this sound from the woods. Not quite a howl, not quite a scream, but something in between that made the hair on my arms stand up. I've lived in rural areas my whole life. I know what bears sound like. I know what cougars sound like. This wasn't either of those. It was something else entirely. I've tried researching, looking up Sasquatch sightings in British Columbia. There are plenty, especially around the more remote areas near Prince George. Some sound similar to what I experienced. Others don't. I don't know what to make of it all. What I do know is this. I saw something that night that shouldn't exist according to science. I saw a creature take one of my animals with an ease that still terrifies me, and even though I've never seen it again, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there. I've thought about selling my place and moving somewhere else, somewhere more populated, but where would I go? And who would buy my property if I told them the truth about what happened here? So I stay. I keep my rifle closer than I used to. I don't go into the woods behind my property anymore. I've installed more security lights, better fences. I bring all the animals into the barn before sunset now, no exceptions. Some nights when I'm lying in bed and can't sleep, I swear I can hear something moving out there, just beyond the reach of my security lights. Something big that knows how to stay hidden. Something watching, waiting. I don't know what it wants or if it'll come back. All I know is that the woods behind my barn now hold something large, something that doesn't belong in our understanding of the natural world. The worst part isn't the fear, though that's bad enough. It's the uncertainty, the not knowing. Did I really see what I think I saw? Am I going crazy? And if I did see it, if it is real, then what else might be out there that we don't know about? I haven't told many people about this. The few I have told look at me like I'm either lying or losing my mind. Maybe I am. God knows I wish I was. But every time I think that, I remember the look of that creature, the impossible strength as it pulled my goat through the fence, the way it moved through the forest. Those aren't things I could make up. Those aren't things I could imagine. Those are things I saw with my own eyes, and no amount of rational thinking can erase that memory. So I keep going day by day. I take care of my remaining goats. I run my small business from home. I try to live a normal life. But I know now that the world is stranger than I ever believed possible. And I know that just beyond the trees at the edge of my property, there's something out there. Something that could return at any moment. And there's nothing I can do about it except wait and watch and wonder. Story 15. I've been hunting since I was a kid. My dad taught me how to track, how to be patient, how to respect the woods and the animals in them. I'm no stranger to strange sounds or animals acting weird, but what happened last November has haunted me every day since. It was deer season, and I'd set up my tree stand in this perfect spot, a wooded hollow that slopes gradually into a swamp about 3 miles from the nearest road. I'd hunted this area for years and knew it like the back of my hand. Nothing unusual had ever happened there before. It was just a good, reliable spot where deer moved through predictably. The stand was about 20 feet up in a solid oak, high enough to keep my scent above most deer, but not so high that a bow shot would be difficult. That evening, I got to my stand around 2 in the afternoon. The weather was perfect. About 45 degrees, overcast, with just a hint of wind coming from the west, which was ideal since deer would be coming from the east and wouldn't catch my scent. I climbed up, got settled, pulled up my bow with my haul line, and just sat there, quietly, the way you do when you're hunting. Just listening, watching, becoming part of the woods. For a few hours, everything was normal. I saw some squirrels, a couple of ravens, nothing unusual. As it got toward evening, maybe around 5 o'clock, the woods were getting that dim quality they get before sunset. That's when I first noticed something was off. The woods got quieter. You know how the forest usually has this background noise? Birds, squirrels, wind in the leaves? It all just stopped. I remember checking my watch, thinking it was getting to be prime time for deer movement, when I spotted 2 does emerging from the thick brush about 40 yards away. They weren't just walking cautiously like deer usually do. They were tearing through the brush, tails up, clearly spooked by something. They paused briefly in a small clearing, looking back over their shoulders, nostrils flaring, before bolting again. My first thought was, buck. Sometimes during the rut, a buck will chase does pretty aggressively. I got excited, thinking this might be my chance at a nice trophy. I slowly stood up in my stand, nocked an arrow, and got ready, eyes fixed on the brush where the does had come from. That's when the smell hit me. I've smelled some nasty things in my life. Dead animals rotting in summer heat, roadkill skunks, manure pits on farms. But this was something else entirely. It was like rotten garbage that had been sitting in the summer sun for weeks, mixed with raw sewage and something else I can't even describe. Musky, wild, but wrong somehow. It was so strong and came on so suddenly that I gagged and had to fight not to vomit. While I was trying to get my stomach under control, I heard movement in the brush where I'd been watching, but it wasn't a deer. The brush was shaking too violently, branches snapping loudly. Whatever was moving through there was big and wasn't concerned about being quiet. Before I could even process what might be making that kind of disturbance, something shot out of the brush. Not an animal, but a log. A fucking log. Like a full-size section of tree trunk, maybe 3 feet long and thick as my thigh. It flew through the air like somebody had thrown it and slammed into the base of my tree with enough force that I felt the impact vibrate up through my stand. I nearly fell out of the tree. My bow slipped from my fingers and dangled from its wrist strap. For a second, I thought maybe a storm had kicked up suddenly and a freak gust of wind had somehow launched a dead branch. But there was no wind. And what I saw next? About 40 yards away, where the brush was thickest, something huge was moving. The brush was shaking violently, branches breaking, undergrowth getting crushed. Whatever it was moving away from me, thank God, heading deeper into the swamp. I couldn't see it clearly, just movement, just this massive dark shape pushing through the vegetation like it was nothing. Then it screamed. I've heard all kinds of animal sounds in the woods, coyotes howling, foxes making their weird bark screams, bobcats yowling during mating season, even a mountain lion once, years ago. But this sound, it started as this deep rumbling growl that I could feel in my chest, then rose into this high-pitched, blood-curdling scream that seemed to go on forever. It wasn't anything I'd ever heard any animal make. It wasn't anything I could imagine any animal making. It wasn't right. It wasn't natural. The sound literally made my hair stand on end. I'm not exaggerating. I felt the hairs on my arms and the back of my neck rise up. A wave of pure terror washed over me. My mouth went dry. My heart hammered in my chest so hard, I thought I might have a heart attack right there in the tree stand. The thing kept crashing through the brush, moving away from me. I could track its progress by the violent shaking of the vegetation and the occasional snap of a larger branch or small tree. Whatever it was strong enough to just push through stuff that would stop a person in their tracks. The noise and movement continued for maybe 30 more seconds, then faded as it got farther away. I just sat there, frozen. I don't know how long I didn't move. Maybe 10 minutes, maybe 30. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. A bear, but bears don't throw logs. A person. No way could a human throw something that heavy that far. And that smell, that horrible stench that still hung in the air. What animal smells like that? My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my bow when I finally got a grip on it again. I knew I should get down from the tree and get the hell out of there, but I was terrified that whatever it was might still be nearby, or worse, might circle back around. So I waited. I waited a full hour, scanning the woods around me, listening for any sound that might indicate that thing was coming back. The sun was setting, and I knew I'd have to navigate back to my truck in the dark if I didn't move soon. That thought terrified me even more. Finally, I decided I had to go. I lowered my bow with shaking hands, then climbed down as quietly as I could, constantly checking over my shoulder. When my feet hit the ground, I nearly jumped out of my skin at the soft thud of my boots on the leaves. The log that had been thrown was right there at the base of my tree. It wasn't some dead, rotted piece of wood that might have been light enough for a person to throw. It was solid oak, freshly broken from a living tree. I couldn't have lifted it myself, let alone thrown it 40 yards. I notched an arrow and started walking back toward my truck about 1.5 miles away. I've never been so scared in my life. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me spinning around, heart in my throat. I kept thinking I heard something following me, just at the edge of hearing. A soft footfall here, a gentle brush of vegetation there. That rotten smell would occasionally waft by on the breeze, making me walk faster. It took me twice as long as normal to get back to my truck because I was stopping constantly to look and listen. By the time I got there, it was fully dark and I was drenched in cold sweat despite the chilly evening. I threw my gear in the bed of my truck, nearly dropping my bow in my haste, and locked myself in the cab. I sat there for a few minutes, just breathing, trying to calm down enough to drive. As I was about to start the engine, I heard it again. That same scream, far off in the distance, back toward the swamp. I started my truck and got the hell out of there. I haven't been back to that spot since. I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a bear with some kind of disease that made it aggressive and smelly. Maybe it was some kind of freak occurrence, a random gust of wind I didn't feel, combined with a tree falling at just the right angle. Maybe I dozed off in my stand and dreamed the whole thing, but I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. I know what I heard, and none of it makes any sense in the world as I understood it before that day. I've been hunting those woods for 15 years, and I thought I knew everything that lived in them. Now I'm not so sure. Now I think there might be things out there we don't have names for, things that don't want to be seen, things that get angry when you intrude on their territory. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that hollow. And whenever I'm in the woods and the birds suddenly go quiet, I find myself looking over my shoulder, listening for heavy footsteps, sniffing the air for that horrible stench, and wondering what else might be out there, watching from the shadows. Story 16. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened at Banks Lake back in June of 2003. It's been over 20 years, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. The sounds, the smells, the absolute terror. I've only told this story to a handful of people because most just laugh or think I'm making it up. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. My buddies, Mark and Dave, had been talking about this fishing trip for months. We were all in our mid-20s, working construction jobs in Spokane, and needed to blow off some steam. Banks Lake in central Washington was supposed to be perfect. Good fishing, not too crowded, and beautiful scenery with those huge basalt cliffs rising up from the water. We packed Mark's old Ford F-150 with camping gear, a cooler full of beer and food, fishing tackle, and this beat-up 12-foot aluminum boat that belonged to Dave's uncle. The first day was exactly what we needed. We set up camp on this secluded stretch of shoreline about 1 mile from the nearest access point. The spot was perfect. A small sandy beach that backed up to thick brush and pine trees with a natural rock outcropping that created a little cove. We caught a few decent smallmouth bass, grilled them up for dinner, drank beers around the campfire, and crashed in our tents. Nothing unusual, just three friends enjoying nature. The second day started out fine. We took the boat out early and had decent luck. I caught a nice 4-pounder that I was pretty proud of, but around 4 in the afternoon, the weather shifted. The wind picked up fast, coming down the canyon and churning the lake into whitecaps. Our little aluminum boat started getting tossed around, and Dave got worried about his uncle's boat getting damaged, so we decided to head back to shore. Instead of just sitting at camp, we figured we could keep fishing from the shoreline near this small inlet where the rocks broke the waves a bit. We dragged the boat up, tied it to a tree, and set up our gear on this flat stretch of sand. Behind us was that dense brush leading into the tree line, maybe 30 yards back from the water. The sun was starting to drop behind the western cliffs, casting these long shadows across the water. That's when things started getting weird. I was focused on baiting my hook when Mark nudged me and asked, "You hear that?" I stopped and listened. At first, I just heard the wind and waves, but then I caught it, cracking branches and rustling in the brush behind us. Not like a squirrel or small animal. These were heavy sounds, like something big moving through the undergrowth. "Probably just deer," Dave said, but I could tell by his voice he wasn't convinced. The sounds continued for about 20 minutes. Stop and start. Stop and start. Then came this rhythmic thudding, almost like footsteps pacing back and forth just out of sight in the tree line. I started feeling this uncomfortable prickling on the back of my neck. You know that feeling when you're being watched? It was that, but 10 times stronger. We kept fishing, trying to ignore it, but we were all on edge. Nobody was saying much. The sun was nearly down now, just a sliver of orange light left on the horizon, and the temperature was dropping fast. I was thinking maybe we should pack up and head back to camp when Dave suddenly froze, his rod halfway through a cast. "Holy shit," he whispered, pointing toward the brush line. "Look at that." I turned, and that's when I saw it. Something massive, and I mean massive, stepped out from between 2 pine trees at the edge of the clearing. In the fading light, I could make out its silhouette clearly. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller, covered in dark, shaggy hair that looked almost black in the shadows. Its arm swung at its side, hanging lower than any human's arm should, and its body was thick, wide shoulders, barrel chest. I could make out its rounded head sitting directly on those shoulders with no visible neck, and a heavy brow ridge that caught what little light was left. And it wasn't just standing there watching us, it was moving toward us, taking these long, deliberate strides. "What the fuck is that?" Mark hissed, dropping his fishing rod. Before any of us could answer, movement from the other side of the clearing caught my eye. Another one appeared, just as tall as the first, but leaner, with lighter colored hair, almost a reddish brown. It walked with the same long, swinging stride, positioning itself between us and the path that led back toward our campsite. I realized with sickening clarity they were cutting off our escape route. The first one stopped about 50 yards away and let out this sound I'll never forget. A deep, rumbling growl that seemed to roll through the clearing and vibrate in my chest. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a cougar, nothing I could identify. The second one answered with this sharp, guttural bark that echoed off the cliffs behind us. They were communicating, working together. "The boat," Dave whispered. "We need to get to the boat." We started backing toward the water, never taking our eyes off the creatures. The darker one moved closer, now maybe 30 yards away. I could see more details of its face. Dark eyes sunken under that heavy ridge, a broad, flat nose and a wide mouth with thin lips drawn tight. Its expression was unmistakable, pure fury. Its jaw was set hard, nostrils flared. The second one was pacing along the brush line, occasionally slapping trees with open hands, making these loud whacks that seemed to punctuate the growls from the first. I've never been so terrified in my life. My legs felt like jelly, and I was struggling to breathe. All those stories about Bigfoot or Sasquatch that I'd laughed at my whole life suddenly didn't seem so funny. "They're blocking us from camp," Mark said, his voice barely audible. We reached the boat, and Dave started shoving it toward the water. The aluminum scraped loudly against the rocks, and the sound seemed to agitate the creatures. The darker one took 2 quick steps forward, raising its arms above its head and letting out a roar that literally froze me in place. The sound was so powerful, so primal, like something from another time. We scrambled into the boat, not caring about our gear anymore. Dave yanked the cord on the small outboard motor, while Mark and I used the oars to push us farther from shore. The motor caught on the 3rd pull, and we lurched into the choppy water. Looking back as we pulled away, I saw both creatures standing at the water's edge, the darker one with its chest heaving, the lighter one just staring at us with this scowled face that I can still see when I close my eyes. They didn't follow us into the water, but they didn't retreat either. They just watched as we fled. We motored all the way to the public boat launch on the other side of the lake, about 3 miles away. None of us said a word the entire trip. We were in shock. We found a group of weekend campers there and asked if we could stay near their site for the night, making up some story about our campsite flooding. I don't think any of us slept at all that night. The next morning, we debated what to do. All our camping gear was still back at our site. Tents, sleeping bags, cooler, everything. We couldn't just leave it all. After much discussion, we decided to go back in broad daylight to retrieve our stuff. The boat ride back was tense. Every shadow in the tree line looked like one of those things waiting for us. When we reached our cove, we cut the motor and drifted in slowly, scanning the shoreline. There was no sign of the creatures, but our campsite was destroyed. The tents were collapsed and torn, sleeping bags strewn about. The cooler had been smashed open, contents scattered everywhere. What really shook me was the shoreline itself. It was torn up with branches scattered all over, trees stripped of bark about 7 to 8 feet up the trunk, and these huge, human-like footprints pressed deep into the wet sand. Some of them had to be 18 inches long. We grabbed what we could salvage and got out of there fast. The whole way back to Spokane, we tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was bears standing on their hind legs, but bears don't walk bipedally for extended periods. Maybe some locals in costumes playing a prank, but that didn't explain the raw power in those vocalizations or how they moved through the brush. I've spent years researching since then, reading accounts from other people who've had similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. Some details match so perfectly with our experience that it makes my skin crawl. Those weren't bears or men in suits. They were Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call them. What haunts me most isn't just that they exist. It's that they were intelligent, the way they positioned themselves to cut off our escape routes, how they seemed to communicate with each other, the purposeful intimidation. They weren't just curious about us. They wanted us gone from that lake, from their territory. Even now, 20 years later, I can see their furious faces. I can hear that bone-shaking roar. I've never gone back to Banks Lake, and I never will. Those creatures are out there, and they don't want us in their woods. And the next people they corner might not be lucky enough to have a boat waiting. Story 17. I've never told this story fully before, not to the press, not even to my wife. It's been 55 years since that day in 1968, and I still wake up sometimes thinking about it. Some things you see in law enforcement stay with you forever, but this wasn't like finding a body or dealing with the aftermath of violence. This was something else entirely. I was police chief in Hialeah Gardens back then, a small but growing area in Miami-Dade County. It was a different time. No cell phones, no computers in our cruisers, just radio dispatch and good old-fashioned police work. We handled everything from domestic disputes to the occasional armed robbery, but mostly it was quiet. That changed on a humid Tuesday in March. The call came in around 2 in the afternoon. Betty, our dispatcher, radioed me directly, which wasn't standard procedure unless something unusual was happening. Chief, we've got a strange one. Got a call from a couple of sanitation workers out at 20 Mile Bend. They're saying they found something unusual in the trash heap. They didn't want to say more over the phone, but they sounded pretty shaken up. I remember sighing, figuring it was probably an alligator that had wandered too far from the Everglades, or maybe someone had dumped a dead pet. It happens sometimes. People too cheap to pay for proper disposal. Tell them I'm on my way and send Rodriguez as backup. I grabbed my hat and headed out to my cruiser. It was hot that day, the kind of sticky heat that makes your uniform cling to your back. The drive to 20 Mile Bend took about 20 minutes, down roads that weren't nearly as developed as they are now. Back then, once you got outside of town, you were basically in wilderness. The dump was technically a county landfill, but everyone called it the trash heap. It was just a big area where people in the sanitation department would dump garbage. No fancy processing or recycling back then, just trash rotting in the Florida sun. When I pulled up, I saw two sanitation workers standing by their truck looking nervous. Rodriguez hadn't arrived yet. The men looked relieved to see me. "Chief," one of them called out, "over here, we've got it cornered behind that pile of old furniture." "Got what cornered?" I asked, already reaching for my sidearm out of habit. The men exchanged glances. "We don't know exactly. At first, we thought it was a kid, then maybe a monkey, but it's neither, sir." I followed them around a large pile of discarded sofas and mattresses. The smell was awful, garbage cooking in the heat, mixed with something else. Something musky and animal-like, but not quite. And there it was. Even now, with decades of perspective, I struggled to describe exactly what I saw. Crouched behind an old refrigerator was a creature about 3 feet tall. It was covered in black fur, not like a bear's thick coat, but thinner, more like a human with extreme hair growth. Where the fur was patchy or thin, I could see skin underneath. Not animal hide, but skin that looked disturbingly human. Its face is what haunts me most. Not quite human, not quite animal. The eyes were large and dark, set in a face that had human-like features, but was proportioned all wrong. The nose was flat, the mouth small, but with visible teeth. When it saw us, it made a sound. Not a growl or a screech, but a sort of mumbling, almost like someone trying to talk without knowing any words. Rodriguez arrived just then, and I heard him swear under his breath when he saw it. "What the hell is that, Chief?" "I don't know," I said honestly, "but we need to secure it." We approached slowly. The creature didn't run or attack. Instead, it did something that still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. It came towards us and clung to my leg like a frightened child would. Its hands, and they were hands, not paws, gripped my uniform pants. It continued making those incoherent mumbling sounds. The sensation of this creature touching me is something I'll never forget. It wasn't aggressive, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Its skin was warm, like a person's, not cool like a reptile's. Its grip was strong, but not threatening. Rodriguez had his hand on his weapon. Should I call animal control? I shook my head. This isn't their jurisdiction. Whatever this is, it's not just an animal. We managed to get it into the back of my cruiser. It didn't fight us, but it didn't cooperate either. It was like handling a confused child who didn't understand what was happening. We didn't cuff it, that seemed wrong somehow, but we did wrap it in a blanket I kept in my trunk. I made the decision to take it to Jackson Memorial Hospital. Looking back, I still think that was the right call. This wasn't something for animal control or the local vet. This needed medical professionals who could examine it properly. The drive to the hospital was surreal. In my rearview mirror, I could see the creature sitting quietly in the back seat, occasionally making those mumbling sounds. Rodriguez followed in his cruiser. I called ahead to the hospital, trying to explain what we were bringing in, but I could tell they thought I was exaggerating or confused. When we arrived, I pulled around to the emergency entrance away from the main doors. A doctor and two nurses were waiting, looking skeptical until I opened the back door of my cruiser. Their expressions changed instantly. The doctor, I wish I could remember his name now, stepped back involuntarily. One of the nurses crossed herself. "My God," the doctor said. "What is it?" "I was hoping you could tell me," I replied. Getting the creature inside was easier than I expected. It seemed to sense we weren't trying to harm it, and walked alongside me, still occasionally clutching at my uniform. We took it to an examination room away from other patients. What happened next is where things get fuzzy, and not just because of the passage of time. It's like there's a deliberate gap in my memory, or maybe in what I was allowed to see. The doctor asked us to wait outside while they examined the creature. Rodriguez and I stood in the hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. Occasionally, we heard the creature making those sounds, a bit louder now, as if distressed. Then a man in a suit arrived. He didn't identify himself, but he had the bearing of government, FBI maybe, or something else. He spoke briefly to the doctor, then approached us. "Thank you for your assistance, gentlemen. We'll take it from here." I started to protest. "This was found in my jurisdiction." He cut me off. "And we appreciate your bringing it in. But this is now a matter for federal authorities." He handed me a form to sign, acknowledging the transfer of custody. I should have refused, demanded more information, but something in his manner made it clear that resistance would be pointless. I signed the paper. Rodriguez and I were escorted out of the hospital through a side entrance. The strange thing is what happened next, or rather, what didn't happen. There was no official record of our bringing the creature in. When I called the hospital the next day, they had no record of the incident. The doctor I'd spoken to was unavailable. The form I signed had vanished. I tried to follow up through official channels. I called the FBI field office in Miami, but they had no knowledge of any operation involving a strange creature. I even drove back to the hospital and tried to find the examination room we'd used, but the staff acted like I was confused or making things up. It was as if the whole thing had never happened, except that Rodriguez had seen it too. We talked about it privately, trying to make sense of what we'd encountered and why it was being covered up. Over the next few weeks, I heard rumors from around the county, sightings of small, dark figures in wooded areas, strange noises at night. Nothing concrete, nothing that made the papers, but enough to make me wonder if there were more of these creatures out there. I made a decision then that I've stood by ever since. I quietly put out the word to my officers. If they encountered anything like what Rodriguez and I had seen, they were not to shoot. These creatures, whatever they were, weren't dangerous if left alone, and there was something about them, that almost human quality, that made the thought of harming them seem wrong. A few months after the incident, Rodriguez transferred to a department up in Broward County. We kept in touch for a while, but we gradually spoke less and less about what we'd seen. It was easier not to think about it, but I've never forgotten. Sometimes I wonder what happened to that creature. Was it studied, released? Is it still alive somewhere in a government facility? Or did it escape back to wherever it came from? I retired from law enforcement in 1987 after nearly 30 years of service. In all that time, I never encountered anything else that defied explanation like that creature did. But the experience changed me. It made me realize that there are things in this world that don't fit into our neat categories, things that exist in the shadows of our understanding. I'm an old man now, and most of the people who might have confirmed or denied my story are gone. The official records show nothing. Jackson Memorial has been renovated and expanded so many times that the room where we took the creature probably doesn't even exist anymore. All I have is what I saw, what I felt when that small, fur-covered hand gripped my uniform. The memory of those eyes looking up at me, frightened, confused, but undeniably aware. Sometimes I drive out past where 20 Mile Bend used to be. It's all developed now, strip malls and housing developments where there used to be wilderness. I look into the small patches of woods that remain and wonder, are they still out there? Those small, dark figures with their almost human hands and their mumbling voices. And if they are, do they remember us as clearly as I remember them? Story 18. I still get nervous walking in the woods at night. Even after 32 years, the memories from that summer in '91 haunt me in ways I can't fully describe. This isn't some ghost story or made-up campfire tale. I wish it was. What happened at that small A-frame cabin on Cordon Ridge Road changed me forever. My brother and I had found what seemed like the perfect getaway. The cabin wasn't much. Simple pine construction with that classic A-frame design. 2 small bedrooms upstairs, a living area and kitchen downstairs. It sat about 50 yards back from the road, with dense woods surrounding it on 3 sides. The rent was dirt cheap, which suited us fine since we were both working entry-level jobs at the time. Cordon, Indiana isn't exactly a tourist destination, but the peace and quiet seemed worth the 30-minute commute to work. The first few weeks were uneventful. We settled in, enjoyed having our own place, and adapted to country living. We even adopted a couple of mutts from the local shelter. Max, a German Shepherd mix, and Cooper, some kind of lab blend. They loved having all that space to run around. It was early July when things started getting weird. I remember because we'd just had a small 4th of July cookout with a few friends the weekend before. I was washing dishes around 10 at night when I heard it. A long, high-pitched scream from somewhere in the woods behind the house. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't like any animal I recognized either. It started low and then crescendoed into this piercing wail that made the hair on my arms stand up. The dogs went absolutely ballistic. Max started barking frantically, running between the back door and me, while Cooper cowered under the kitchen table whining. My brother came downstairs asking what the hell was going on. Probably just a bobcat or something, I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But deep down, I knew bobcats don't sound like that. This was different, louder, more deliberate somehow. The screaming continued for about 20 minutes, sometimes closer, sometimes further away. It seemed to be moving around the perimeter of our property. I grabbed my shotgun from the closet, not because I planned to hunt whatever it was, but because having it made me feel safer. I fired a warning shot into the air from the back porch, hoping to scare it off. The woods went completely silent after that. Not just the screaming stopped, but everything. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. That silence was almost worse than the screaming. The next night it happened again. Same time, around 10 p.m., the same high-pitched wailing, but this time it seemed closer to the house. Again, I fired a warning shot, and again, everything went quiet. This pattern continued for about a week. The screaming would start, the dogs would freak out, I'd fire a shot and it would go quiet. But each night, it seemed like the source of the screams was getting closer to our cabin. By the end of the week, it sounded like it was coming from just inside the tree line, maybe 30 yards from our back door. I called the local game warden, but he just chuckled and said, probably just coyotes. They can sound awful human-like sometimes. But these weren't coyotes. I'd heard coyotes plenty of times growing up. This was something else. My friend James was into outdoor survival stuff and offered to camp out in the woods to see if he could figure out what was making the noise. I thought he was crazy, but he insisted. He set up a small tent about 100 yards into the forest behind our place and stayed there for one night. He showed up at our door at dawn, looking pale and wide-eyed. "I'm not staying another night out there," he said, his hands shaking as he accepted the coffee I offered. When I asked him what happened, he was reluctant to talk at first. Finally, he told me that around 2 in the morning, he heard heavy footsteps circling his tent. Not like a person walking. Heavier, with a strange cadence to them. He peeked out and swears he saw something tall moving between the trees. He described it as being covered in hair, walking on two legs, but definitely not human. "I know how this sounds," he kept saying. "I know how crazy this sounds." But James wasn't the type to make up stories or exaggerate. He was a former army guy, level-headed and practical. Whatever he saw scared him enough that he packed up and left before sunrise. After James's experience, my brother and I started locking everything up tight at night. We kept the dogs inside after dark and made sure all the windows were secured. The screaming continued, now seemingly right at the edge of our yard some nights. Then, about 3 weeks after the first incident, my brother woke me up in the middle of the night. He was shaking, his face drained of color. "There's something outside my window," he whispered. His bedroom was on the second floor with a small window that faced the backyard and woods. The window was probably 9 feet off the ground. "What do you mean?" I asked, grabbing the shotgun from beside my bed. "I woke up because I felt like someone was watching me," he said. "When I opened my eyes, there was this shape blocking the moonlight from my window. Something big." I carefully approached his bedroom, the dogs following nervously behind me. When I looked out the window, there was nothing there, but I noticed the tops of the pine trees at the edge of our yard swaying slightly, even though there wasn't any wind. "How big was it?" I asked him. "It filled the whole window," he said, and I could see the outline of a head and shoulders against the sky. It had to be at least 8 feet tall to be looking in like that. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. We sat in the living room with all the lights on, the shotgun across my lap, until morning came. The next day, I walked the perimeter of the house and found something that made my stomach drop. A line of prints in the soft earth beneath my brother's window. They weren't clear enough to make out details, but they were big, maybe 15 inches long, and deep, like whatever made them was extremely heavy. That night was the worst. Around midnight, the loudest howl I've ever heard erupted from directly beneath the house. Our cabin was built on a slight slope with a crawl space underneath the back portion. The sound was so loud it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't like the screams from before. This was deeper, more guttural, almost like a challenge. The dogs completely lost it. Cooper wedged himself so far under my bed that I couldn't coax him out, and Max ran upstairs and started frantically scratching at the bathroom door until I let him in. He then jumped into the empty bathtub and refused to come out, shaking violently. Then came the worst part, a heavy thudding against the back door. Not knocking, more like something large pressing against it, testing its strength. The whole frame creaked with each thud. I was terrified the door would give way. I stood at the top of the stairs, shotgun aimed at the door, my hands shaking so badly I'm not sure I could have hit anything if I'd tried. This continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The rest of the night passed in silence, but neither my brother nor I dared to go downstairs until daylight. In the morning, what we found chilled me to the bone. The back steps, solid wooden stairs built into the deck, were crushed inward, splintered as if something incredibly heavy had climbed them. The door frame around the deadbolt was splintered and pushed inward nearly an inch. Whatever had been pressing against the door had almost broken through, and it must have possessed enormous strength. But the thing that finally drove me out was the smell. When we opened the door, this overwhelming stench hit us, a nauseating mix of feces, wet dog hair, skunk-like musk and ammonia. It was so strong it made my eyes water, and it wasn't just outside. Somehow the smell had seeped into the house, particularly strong near the fireplace and air vents. That was it for me. I packed my essentials that morning and moved in with a friend in town. My brother stayed one more night, but joined me the next day. We paid out our rent for the month, but I never spent another night in that cabin. When I tried telling locals about what happened, the reactions were frustrating. Some laughed it off, suggesting we'd encountered a bear, though there hadn't been bears in that part of Indiana for decades. Others simply refused to listen, changing the subject or walking away mid-conversation. A few older residents gave me strange looks, like they knew something but wouldn't say it. I drove by the property a few years later, around 96 or 97. The cabin was gone, completely disassembled and removed. The spot sat empty for several years after that. Eventually, someone built a brick house there, set further back from the woods than our cabin had been. I've tried researching similar incidents in the area, but there's not much documented. Occasionally I'll hear about strange screams or large, unidentified animals in rural parts of southern Indiana, and my stomach knots up instantly. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined it all, if there's some rational explanation for what happened that summer. But then I remember James's face when he came out of those woods, the prints under my brother's window, and the splintered doorframe that nearly gave way to something powerful enough to break through solid oak. I don't know what was in those woods in '91, but whatever it was real, it was intelligent, and it wanted in our house. And to this day, whenever I hear strange sounds at night, part of me freezes, waiting to hear that high, inhuman scream again.